Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. Comment below if you like. If you have authors that you'd like to see recognized, list them in the comments or contact our author page. Subscribe for more tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten. We'll have quite a collection climbing out of the tombs. If you like any of our tales, comment, ring the bell, and crush the like button below. Unknown Horror Masters. The Skull and Bones collection for our upcoming episodes are ready to rise up. Keep sending fresh blood for our ravenous appetite. Check out our other stories and our websites. YouTube, BitChute, Rumble, Dweller of the Dark. Official website, dwellerofthedark.com. You can find us on Facebook at Jeffrey LeBlanc, Horror Writer. Our books are on Kindle and Amazon. Follow, support us on Twitter, Instagram, Patreon, Bandcamp. Dweller of the Dark. Children of Horror. We present A Night of Cats and Wolves. Enjoy. If a werewolf is slain as a man, then his half-soul will haunt his slayer forever. In the Forest of Villefere by Robert E. Howard. The sun had set. The great shadows came striding over the forest. In the weird twilight of a late summer day, I saw the path ahead glide on among the mighty trees and disappear. And I shuddered and glanced fearfully over my shoulder. Miles behind lay the nearest village, miles ahead the next. I looked to left and to right as I strode on, and anon I looked behind me, and anon I stopped short, grasping my rapier, as a breaking twig betokened the going of some small beast. Or was it a beast? But the path led on, and I followed, because, forsooth, I had naught else to do. As I went, I bethought me, my own thoughts will rout me if I be not aware. What is there in this forest, except perhaps the creatures that roam it, deer and the like? Tush! The foolish legends of those villagers. And so I went, and the twilight faded into dusk. Stars began to blink, and the leaves of the trees murmured in the faint breeze. And then I stopped short, my sword leaping to my hand. For just ahead, around the curve of the path, someone was singing. The words I could not distinguish, but the accent was strange, almost barbaric. I stepped behind a great tree, and the cold sweat beaded my forehead. Then the singer came in sight, a tall, thin man, vague in the twilight. I shrugged my shoulders. A man I did not fear. I sprang out, my point raised. Stand! He showed no surprise. I prithee handle thy blade with care, friend, he said. Somewhat ashamed, I lowered my sword. I am new to this forest, I quoth apologetically. I heard talk of bandits, I crave pardon. Where lies the road to Villefere? Corbleu, you've missed it, he answered. You should have branched off to the right some distance back. I'm going there myself. If you may abide my company, I will direct you. I hesitated. Yet why should I hesitate? Why, certainly. My name is the Mentor of Normandy. And I am Carolus Leloup. No, I started back. He looked at me in astonishment. Pardon? Said I. The name is strange. Does not loop mean wolf? My family were always great hunters, he answered. He did not offer his hand. You will pardon my staring, said I as we walked down the path. But I can hardly see your face in the dusk. I sensed that he was laughing, though he made no sound. It is little to look upon, he answered. Welcome to Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. Comment below if you like. If you have authors that you'd like to see recognized, list them in the comments or contact our author page. Subscribe for more tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten. We'll have quite a collection climbing out of the tombs. If you like any of our tales, comment, ring the bell, and crush the like button below. Unknown Horror Masters. The Skull and Bones collection for our upcoming episodes are ready to rise up. Keep sending fresh blood for our ravenous appetite. Check out our other stories and our websites. YouTube, BitChute, Rumble, Dweller of the Dark. Official website, dwellerofthedark.com. You can find us on Facebook at Jeffrey LeBlanc, Horror Writer. Our books are on Kindle and Amazon. Follow, support us on Twitter, Instagram, Patreon, Bandcamp. Dweller of the Dark. Children of Horror. We present A Night of Cats and Wolves. Enjoy. If a werewolf is slain as a man, then his half-soul will haunt his slayer forever. In the Forest of Villefere by Robert E. Howard. The sun had set. The great shadows came striding over the forest. In the weird twilight of a late summer day, I saw the path ahead glide on among the mighty trees and disappear. And I shuddered and glanced fearfully over my shoulder. Miles behind lay the nearest village, miles ahead the next. I looked to left and to right as I strode on, and anon I looked behind me, and anon I stopped short, grasping my rapier, as a breaking twig betokened the going of some small beast. Or was it a beast? But the path led on, and I followed, because, forsooth, I had naught else to do. As I went, I bethought me, my own thoughts will rout me if I be not aware. What is there in this forest, except perhaps the creatures that roam it, deer and the like? Tush! The foolish legends of those villagers. And so I went, and the twilight faded into dusk. Stars began to blink, and the leaves of the trees murmured in the faint breeze. And then I stopped short, my sword leaping to my hand. For just ahead, around the curve of the path, someone was singing. The words I could not distinguish, but the accent was strange, almost barbaric. I stepped behind a great tree, and the cold sweat beaded my forehead. Then the singer came in sight, a tall, thin man, vague in the twilight. I shrugged my shoulders. A man I did not fear. I sprang out, my point raised. Stand! He showed no surprise. I prithee handle thy blade with care, friend, he said. Somewhat ashamed, I lowered my sword. I am new to this forest, I quoth apologetically. I heard talk of bandits, I crave pardon. Where lies the road to Villefere? Corbleu, you've missed it, he answered. You should have branched off to the right some distance back. I'm going there myself. If you may abide my company, I will direct you. I hesitated. Yet why should I hesitate? Why, certainly. My name is de Montour of Normandy. And I am Carolus Leloup. No, I started back. He looked at me in astonishment. Pardon? Said I. The name is strange. Does not loup mean wolf? My family were always great hunters, he answered. He did not offer his hand. You will pardon my staring, said I as we walked down the path. But I can hardly see your face in the dusk. I sensed that he was laughing, though he made no sound. It is little to look upon, he answered. I stepped closer and then leaped away, my hair bristling. A mask, I exclaimed. Why do you wear a mask, monsieur? It is a vow, he explained. In fleeing a pack of hounds, I vowed that if I escaped, I would wear a mask for a certain time. Hounds, monsieur? Wolves, he answered quickly. I said wolves. We walked in silence for a while, and then my companion said, I am surprised that you walk these woods by night. Few people come these ways, even in the day. I am in haste to reach the border, I answered. A treaty has been signed with the English, and the Duke of Burgundy should know of it. The people at the village sought to dissuade me. They spoke of a wolf that was purported to roam these woods. Here the path branches to Villefere, said he, and I saw a narrow, crooked path that I had not seen when I passed it before. It led in amid the darkness of the trees. I shuddered. You wish to return to the village? No, I exclaimed. No, no! Lead on. So narrow was the path that we walked single file, he leading. I looked well at him. He was taller, much taller than I, and thin, wiry. He was dressed in a costume that smacked of Spain. A long rapier swung at his hip. He walked with long, easy strides, noiselessly. Then he began to talk of travel and adventure. He spoke of many lands and seas he had seen and many strange things. So we talked and went farther and farther into the forest. I presumed that he was French, and yet he had a very strange accent that was neither French nor Spanish nor English, nor like any language I had ever heard. Some words he slurred strangely, and some he could not pronounce at all. This path is not often used, is it? I asked. Not by many, he answered, and laughed silently. I shuddered. It was very dark, and the leaves whispered together among the branches. A fiend haunts this forest, I said. So the peasants say, he answered, but I have roamed it oft, and have never seen his face. Then he began to speak of strange creatures of darkness, and the moon rose, and shadows glided among the trees. He looked up at the moon. Haste, said he. We must reach our destination before the moon reaches her zenith. We hurried along the trail. They say, said I, that a werewolf haunts these woodlands. It might be, said he, and we argued much upon the subject. The old women say, said he, that if a werewolf is slain while a wolf, then he is slain. But if he is slain as a man, then his half-soul will haunt his slayer forever. But haste thee, the moon nears her zenith. We came into a small moonlit glade, and the stranger stopped. "Let us pause a while," said he. "Nay, let us be gone," I urged. "I like not this place." He laughed without sound. "Why?" said he. "This is a fair glade, as good as a banquet hall it is, and many times have I feasted here. Ha ha ha! Look ye, I will show you a dance." And he began bounding here and there, anon flinging back his head and laughing silently. Thought I, the man is mad. As he danced his weird dance, I looked about me. The trail went not on, but stopped in the glade. "Come," said I, "we must on. Do you not smell the rank, hairy scent that hovers about the glade? Wolves den here. Perhaps they are about us and are gliding upon us even now." He dropped upon all fours, bounded higher than my head, and came toward me with a strange slinking motion. "That dance is called the dance of the wolf," said he, and my hair bristled. "Keep off!" I stepped back, and with a screech that set the echoes shuddering, he leaped for me, and though a sword hung at his belt, he did not draw it. My rapier was half out when he grasped my arm and flung me headlong. I dragged him with me, and we struck the ground together. Wrenching a hand free, I jerked off the mask. A shriek of horror broke from my lips. Beast eyes glittered beneath that mask. White fangs flashed in the moonlight. The face was that of a wolf. In an instant, those fangs were at my throat. Taloned hands tore the sword from my grasp. I beat at that horrible face with my clenched fist, but his jaws were fastened on my shoulder. His talons tore at my throat. Then I was on my back. The world was fading. Blindly I struck out. My hand dropped, then closed automatically about the hilt of my dagger, which I had been unable to get at. I drew and stabbed. A terrible, half-bestial bellowing screech. Then I reeled to my feet free. At my feet lay the werewolf. I stooped, raised the dagger, then paused, looked up. The moon hovered close to her zenith. If I slew the thing as a man, its frightful spirit would haunt me forever. I sat down waiting. The thing watched me with flaming wolf eyes. The long wiry limbs seemed to shrink, to crook. Hair seemed to grow upon them. Fearing madness, I snatched up the thing's own sword and hacked it to pieces. Then I flung the sword away and fled. The Silver Knife by Ralphallanlang. A shivery tale of Wolf Dahlgren and his gruesome adventure with a great wolf that trailed him through the Arctic waste. When Ross Nagel returned in less than a fortnight from his first manhunt in the uniform of a Northwest mounted policeman, it was a matter of surprise to all who witnessed his return to barracks. It was not that anyone doubted his ability, for he came to the Mounties with an enviable service record in His Majesty's troops in the Far East. The surprise was due to the fact that he had been assigned to the trail of Wolf Dahlgren, a veritable wolf of the North, whose familiar ground constituted no less than 1,000 square miles of frozen waste. Still more surprised was the post commander when Nagel, in making his report, laid before him a package containing 2 curious articles. The first of these was well calculated to inspire the astonishment with which the inspector regarded it. It was a knife of falchion shape with a wicked curve at the point that suggested the purpose for which it had originally been made, a sacrificial knife. In the eyes of the inspector, this impression was further confirmed by the material of which it was made, beaten silver, and by the pair of great twin rubies that ornamented the hilt. He had once seen a knife almost exactly similar to it while attached as guard to an expedition excavating the ruins of an ancient temple of Dagon. But what could such a knife, with its priceless inset gems, be doing here in the Arctic wastes of North America? Only one explanation presented itself to the puzzled mind of the inspector: that it had been brought by an immigrating Old World tribe in some dim period of history when the continents were still connected by a strip of land. A remnant of this tribe might conceivably still exist in the unexplored regions of the North, the sacred knife having been handed down from generation to generation. How had Wolf Dahlgren gained possession of it while under pursuit by the Mounties on a murder charge? He turned his attention to the other article on the desk, a small, leather-bound notebook, in hopes that it might furnish an explanation. It was in good condition, except for bloodstains on the cover, legibly written, and the inspector leaned back to read. The first entry was dated 2 weeks previously. December 3rd. With this entry, I begin another diary, one of a long series written to be destroyed, that have solaced the loneliness of 3 years spent on Arctic trails. It is lonely here in Camp the Night, with the nearest white settlement 200 miles away, and a hard day's trailing from the native village where I passed the last week. If luck stays with me, this will be my last trek through this bitter, accursed country, and luck at last is coming my way. After 3 years of freezing, starving, and murdering miserable creatures for contemptible amounts, luck puts me in possession of a treasure more valuable than any gold mine in the north. The simple Indian fools who used the silver knife in their sacrificial service could have no idea of the value of the great rubies in its hilt. To them, it is merely a religious relic handed down from long-forgotten ancestors. To me, it is freedom, life, luxury, the silver key of desire. It is right and just that I should have the knife. Who have so much better use for it than any the old sachem ever put it to? They will not have missed it until twilight tonight, and no Indians will cover as much trail in 2 days as the one I have left behind me today. In less than 2 weeks, I will hit the seacoast. Then for a ship to the States, and the Mounties can have their north. December 4th. Another good day's trailing, bettering perhaps the distance made yesterday. Nothing of interest has occurred, and I have seen no living thing except a skulking timber wolf. It is remarkable in that it is the largest I have ever seen. A great, shaggy brute, standing inches higher than any of my huskies, and it seems to be following me. Doubtless, it is beginning to feel the pinch of winter hunger. December 5th. An astounding thing occurred last night, unparalleled in all of my experience in the north. An attack by a wolf or wolves on a camp protected by an open fire. It was well after midnight, and due to the fact that I was sleeping more soundly than usual, the fire had subsided almost into a bed of coals when I was jarred awake by a sharp yelp from the dogs, followed by the snarling fury of a fight. It could not be called a fight either, for the wolf or wolves were gone again into the night as swiftly as they had come, and I had only a brief glimpse of one shaggy giant as he faded into the obscurity of the darkness. But brief as the engagement was, its effect was devastating to my team, the lead dog having been literally torn to ribbons and another slashed on the shoulder. As a consequence, I was able to make but poor time today, and I had trouble constantly with the dogs. So demoralized is their condition. What puzzles me is that the attackers seemed to make no effort to obtain food, but I suppose that my awakening frightened them away. I have seen the lone wolf several times today, dogging my trail at an uncomfortably close distance. On one occasion, I was close enough to see his devilish fangs as he stood and snarled his hatred. 2 clear shots I had at him before he retreated, and I am unable to explain how I could have missed him. I have seen no other wolves at any time, and am almost forced to believe that it was he alone who made the attack last night, although it seems impossible that one wolf could wreak such havoc. Tonight, I will keep a sharp watch to prevent a repetition of it. December 6th. The wolf was back last night, and despite all of my precautions, took toll of another of my dogs. I was sleeping lightly with my rifle at the ready, and was up at the first sound, getting my first close sight of him as he raised his bloody fangs from the husky's throat and turned to face me. He must have stood nearly 3 feet high, but it was the ghoulish fury in his yellow eyes that unnerved me more than his great stature. I fired point blank at the hideous head, but still he stood there fixing me with that baleful glare, and it was not until the pack closed in on his flank that he turned and loped away. 3 dogs only are left of my original 5, and these are so demoralized with terror that I can make but poor headway. I, too, own myself a victim of intense nervousness and am weighted down by an uncanny, unreasonable feeling of dread. If I were more susceptible to superstitious beliefs, I might find myself imagining all sorts of weird explanations of my failure to drop him at point blank with a rifle that has brought down moose. As it is, though I take no stock in werewolf tales, my mental condition is such that I would not be above trying a silver bullet on him if I had one, merely to relieve my nerves. December 7th. The thing was back again last night, but this time he appeared in a different manner. He is bold now, and appeared as soon as dusk had fallen, skulking in the shadows just outside the circle of firelight. 3 hours I sat there, under the spell of those hellish yellow eyes, now appearing on one side of the circle, now on the other, compelling me frequently to change my position in order to watch him. I fired again and again, with no result, except that the eyes moved to another position. Then it happened. Before I knew what had occurred, I was pouring shot after shot into the charging beast until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He was so close that the hateful eyes seemed burning through my brain. And in desperate agony, I grasped the only weapon my hand fell upon, the silver knife. What happened then, I do not clearly know, but he swerved away from me, and in some unexplainable way, I sensed fear in his snarl. Then he was among the dogs, ripping and slashing, and a third victim was torn to ribbons. My nerve is shattered, and I scarcely know what to believe. Bullets have no effect on the thing, and I am here in the wilderness, 100 miles from civilization, with no protection against him. I have one hope, founded on the manner in which he avoided me last night. For some reason, he fears me, although I am absolutely helpless before him. My only hope now is to push on to the coast with the 2 dogs I have left, praying that these too may not fall victims before I reach there. December 8th. I am writing this now, not to dispel loneliness or even nervousness, but in sheer terror, and to take my mind off the horror that is prowling outside. It may be the last page of this ghastly tale, for the thing has grown desperate now, and apparently has submerged its fear of me in the greater fear of my reaching civilization and escaping it. Since early morning, I have pushed forward at a killing pace, with the thing growing steadily in confidence or in desperation, and drawing closer to me with every mile. At noon, I reached this abandoned miner's cabin and was able to gain its shelter in just the nick of time. The thing evidently can think, for at sight of the cabin, it threw all caution to the winds and charged, straining me to the utmost to reach the door and forcing me to abandon the dogs. Their cries were pitiful, for so greatly had the terror grown upon them that they did not even try to fight. Watching from a small high window on the north side of the cabin, I was sickened at the savage rending of their bodies and at the ghastly aspect of its bloody snout as it raised its head and gave vent to a blood-chilling howl, the first sound I have heard it utter. I cannot describe the nightmare of horror that closed down on my brain as it rang through the silence, and which has left me completely unmanned. It was minutes before I could pull myself together enough to make a search of the cabin for any means of defense, and then at last luck smiled and gave me a glimmer of hope. Among a collection of useless odds and ends left by the miners, I found an old bullet mold, and the thought has come to me that I may be able to melt enough silver from the knife to run a bullet. Weird and ridiculous as the idea seems, I am convinced that the thing outside can be nothing else than a werewolf, and my only hope is to try a silver bullet, to which alone they are said to be vulnerable. I have pried all of the loose wood obtainable off of the studding and wait now for the fire to burn into coals hot enough to melt the silver. It is almost ready, and I stop now to break a piece from the guard of the knife. All hope of killing the thing is now gone. The wood I have is too dry and lifeless to make a fire hot enough to melt the silver. I must play a waiting game now. For as long as the provisions in my shoulder knapsack hold out, I am safe. In its wolf form, the thing cannot open the door, although I have no way of barring it. And if it assumes human shape, I will kill it with a bullet. It is whining now and scratching against the wall in an effort to rear up high enough to look in the window. Now it is padding back and forth before the door, trying doubtless to work up courage to assume its human form. And there, now, is a hand on the latch. It has been 3 minutes now since the latch was raised. Fear is doubtless holding him back. At any moment, he may conquer it, but I am ready. Hounds of hell! Can it be possible that he is changing back into a wolf again? There was a strange look on Inspector Moore's face as he raised his eyes in a questioning glance to the face of the constable, who still waited. Just how did you come into possession of these? He asked. Nagel's face showed plainly that he too had perused the contents of the diary. I found them in an abandoned miner's cabin beyond Bitter Creek, he answered slowly. Wolf Dahlgren was in there, dead, his throat torn as though by the fangs of a wolf. I found this diary on the table beside him. There was another corpse in there too, a wrinkled old Indian whose weird ceremonial garb marked him as some kind of medicine man or sachem. It was in his breast that I found the silver knife. The Phantom Farmhouse by Seabury Quinn. Here's a story of creeping horror that rises gradually to a powerful climax. It's a story not easily forgotten. I had been at the New Briarcliff Sanitarium nearly 3 weeks before I actually saw the house. Every morning, as I lay abed after the nurse had taken my temperature, I wondered what was beyond the copse of fir and spruce at the turn of the road. The picture seemed incomplete, without chimneys rising among the evergreens. I thought about it so much, I finally convinced myself there really was a house in the wood. A house where people lived and worked and were happy. All during the long, trying days when I was learning to navigate a wheelchair, I used to picture the house and the people who lived in it. There would be a father, I was sure, a stout, good-natured father, somewhat bald, who sat on the porch and smoked a cob pipe in the evening. And there was a mother, too, a waistless, plaid-skirted mother with hair smoothly parted over her forehead, who sat beside the father as he rocked and smoked, and who had a brown workbasket in her lap. She spread the stocking feet over her outstretched fingers, and her vigilant needle spied out and closed every hole with a cunning no mechanical loom could rival. Then there was a daughter. I was a little hazy in my conception of her, but I knew she was tall and slender as a hazel wand, and that her eyes were blue and wide and sympathetic. Picturing the house and its people became a favorite pastime with me during the time I was acquiring the art of walking all over again.
By the time I was able to trust my legs on the road, I felt I knew my way to my vision friend's home, as well as I knew the byways of my own parish, though I had as yet not set foot outside the sanitarium. Oddly enough, I chose the evening for my first long stroll. It was unusually warm for September in Maine, and some of the sturdier of the convalescents had been playing tennis during the afternoon. After dinner, they sat on the veranda, comparing notes on their respective cases of influenza or matching experiences in appendicitis operations. After building the house bit by bit from my imagination, as a child pieces together a picture puzzle, I should have been bitterly disappointed if the woods had proved empty. Yet, when I reached the turn of the road and found my dream house a reality, I was almost afraid. Bit for bit and part for part, it was as I had visualized it. A long, rambling, comfortable-looking farmhouse it was, with a wide porch screened by vines and a whitewashed picket fence about the little clearing before it. There was a tumble-down gate in the fence, one of the kind that is held shut with a weighted chain. Looking closely, I saw the weight was a disused plowshare. Leading from gate to porch was a path of flat stones laid unevenly in the short grass and bordered with a double row of clamshells. A lamp burned in the front room, sending out cheerful golden rays to meet the silver moonlight. A strange, eerie sensation came over me as I stood there. Somehow, I felt I had seen that house before. Many, many times before. Yet, I had never been in that part of Maine till I came to Briarcliff, nor had anyone ever described the place to me. Indeed, except for my idle dreams, I had no intimation that there was a house in those pines at all. Who lives in the house at the turn of the road? I asked the fat man who roomed next to me. He looked at me as blankly as if I had addressed him in Choctaw, then countered, "What road?" "Why, the South Road," I explained. "I mean the house in the pines, just beyond the curve, you know." If such a thing had not been obviously absurd, I should have thought he looked frightened at my answer. Certainly, his already prominent eyes started a bit further from his face. "Nobody lives there," he assured me. "Nobody's lived there for years. There isn't any house there." I became angry. What right had this fellow to make my civil question the occasion for an ill-timed jest? "As you please," I replied. "Perhaps there isn't any house there for you, but I saw one there last night." "My God!" he ejaculated and hurried away as if I'd just told him I was infected with smallpox. Later in the day, I overheard a snatch of conversation between him and one of his acquaintances in the lounge. "I tell you, it's so," he was saying with great earnestness. "I thought it was all a lot of poppycock myself, but that clergyman saw it last night. I'm going to pack my traps and get back to the city and not waste any time about it either." "Rats," his companion scoffed. "He must have been stringing you." Turning to light a cigar, he caught sight of me. "Say, Mr. Weatherby," he called, "you didn't mean to tell my friend here that you really saw a house down by those pines last night, did you?" "I certainly did," I answered. "And I tell you, too, there's nothing unusual about it, is there?" "Is there?" he repeated.
Is there? Say, what did it look like?
I described it to him as well as I could, and his eyes grew as wide as those of a child hearing the story of Bluebeard.
Well, I'll be a Chinaman's uncle,
he declared as I finished.
I sure will.
See here, I demanded. What's all the mystery about that farmhouse? Why shouldn't I see it? It's there to be seen, isn't it? He gulped once or twice, as if there were something hot in his mouth, before he answered.
Look here, Mr. Weatherby. I'm telling you this for your own good. You'd better stay in o' nights, and you'd better stay away from those pines in particular.
Nonplussed at this unsolicited advice, I was about to ask an explanation when I detected the aftertang of whiskey on his breath. I understood then. I was being made the butt of a drunken joke by a pair of racecourse followers. I'm very much obliged, I'm sure, I replied with dignity. But if you don't mind, I'll choose my own comings and goings.
Oh, go as far as you like.
He waved his arms wide in token of my complete free agency.
Go as far as you like. I'm going to New York.
And he did. The pair of them left the sanitarium that afternoon. A slight recurrence of my illness held me housebound for several days after my conversation with the two sportively inclined gentlemen, and the next time I ventured out at night, the moon had waxed to the full, pouring a flood of light upon the earth that rivaled midday. The minutest objects were as readily distinguished as they would have been before sunset. In fact, I remember comparing the evening to a silver-plated noon. As I trudged along the road to the pine copse, I was busy formulating plans for intruding into the family circle at the farmhouse, devising all manner of pious frauds by which to scrape acquaintance. Shall I feign having lost my way and inquire direction to the sanitarium? Or shall I ask if some mythical acquaintance, a John Squires, for instance, lives there? I asked myself as I neared the turn of the road. Fortunately for my conscience, all these subterfuges were unnecessary, for as I neared the whitewashed fence, a girl left the porch and walked quickly to the gate, where she stood gazing pensively along the moonlit road. It was almost as if she were coming to meet me, I thought, as I slackened my pace and assumed an air of deliberate casualness. Almost abreast of her, I lowered my cadence still more and looked directly at her. Then I knew why my conception of the girl who lived in that house had been misty and indistinct. For the same reason the venerable John had faltered in his description of the New Jerusalem until his vision in the Isle of Patmos. From the smoothly parted hair above her wide forget-me-not eyes to the hem of her white cotton frock, she was as slender and lovely as a Rossetti saint, as wonderful to the eye as a medieval poet's vision of his lost love in paradise. Her forehead, evenly framed in the beaten bronze of her hair, was wide and high, and startlingly white, and her brows were delicately penciled, as if laid on by an artist with a camel's hair brush. The eyes themselves were sweet and clear as forest pools, mirroring the September sky, and lifted a little at the corners, like an oriental's, giving her face a quaint, exotic look in the midst of these Maine woods. So slender was her figure that the swell of her bosom was barely perceptible under the light stuff of her dress, and as she stood immobile in the nimbus of moon rays, the undulation of the line from her shoulders to ankles was what painters call a curve of motion. One hand rested lightly on the gate, finely cut as a bit of Italian sculpture, and scarcely less white than the limed wood supporting it. I noticed idly that the forefinger was somewhat longer than its fellows, and that the nails were almond-shaped and very pink, almost red, as if they had been rouged and brightly polished. No man can take stock of a woman thus, even in a cursory, fleeting glimpse, without her being aware of the inspection. And in the minute my eyes drank up her beauty, our glances crossed and held. The look she gave back was as calm and unperturbed as though I had been non-existent. One might have thought I was an invisible wraith of the night. Yet the faint suspicion of a flush quickening in her throat and cheeks told me she was neither unaware nor unappreciative of my scrutiny. Mechanically, I raised my cap, and, wholly without conscious volition, I heard my own voice asking, "May I trouble you for a drink from your well? I'm from the sanitarium, only a few days out of bed, in fact, and I fear I've overdone myself in my walk." A smile flitted across her rather wide lips, quick and sympathetic as a mother's response to her child's request, as she swung the gate open for me. "Surely," she answered, and her voice had all the sweetness of the south wind soughing through her native pines. "Surely you may drink at our well, and rest yourself, too, if you wish." She preceded me up the path, quickening her pace as she neared the house, and running nimbly up the steps to the porch. From where I stood beside the old-fashioned well, fitted with windlass and bucket, I could hear the sound of whispering voices in earnest conversation. Hers I recognized, lowered though it was, by the flute-like purling of its tones. The other two were deeper, and, it seemed to me, hoarse and throaty. Somehow, odd as it seemed, there was a queer canine note in them, dimly reminding me of the muttering of not too friendly dogs. Such fractious growls I had heard while doing missionary duty in Alaska, when the savage half-wolf malamutes were not fed promptly at the relay stations. Her voice rose a thought higher, as if in argument, and I fancied I heard her whisper, "This one is mine, I tell you. Mine. I'll brook no interference. Go to your own hunting." An instant more, there was a reluctant, assenting growl from the shadow of the vines curtaining the porch, and a light laugh from the girl as she descended the steps, swinging a bright tin cup in her hand. For a second, she looked at me as she sent the bucket plunging into the stone-curbed well. Then she announced, in explanation, "We're great hunters here, you know. The season is just in, and Dad and I have the worst quarrels about whose game is whose." She laughed, in recollection of their argument, and I laughed with her. I had been quite a Nimrod as a boy myself, and well I remembered the heated controversies as to whose charge of shot was responsible for some luckless bunny's demise. The well was very deep, and my breath was coming fast by the time I had helped her wind the bucket rope upon the windlass. but the water was cold as only spring-fed well water can be. As she poured it from the bucket, it shone almost like foam in the moonlight, and seemed to whisper with a half-human voice instead of gurgling as other water does when poured. I had drunk water in nearly every quarter of the globe, but never such water as that. Cold as the breath from a glacier, limpid as visualized air, it was yet so light and tasteless in substance that only the chill in my throat and the sight of the liquid in the cup told me that I was doing more than going through the motions of drinking. "And now, will you rest?" she invited as I finished my third draught. "We've an extra chair on the porch for you." Behind the screen of vines, I found her father and mother seated in the rays of the big kitchen lamp. They were just as I had expected to find them, plain, homely, sincere country folk, courteous in their reception and anxious to make a sick stranger welcome. Both were stout, with the comfortable stoutness of middle age and good health, but both had surprisingly slender hands. I noticed, too, that the same characteristic of an overlong forefinger was apparent in their hands as in their daughters, and that both their nails were trimmed to points and stained almost a brilliant red. "My father, Mr. Squires," the girl introduced, "and my mother, Mrs. Squires." I could not repress a start. These people bore the very name I had casually thought to use when inquiring for some imaginary person. My lucky stars had surely guided me away from that attempt to scrape an acquaintance. What a figure I should have cut if I had actually asked for Mr. Squires. Though I was not aware of it, my curious glance must have stayed longer on their red nails than I had intended, for Mrs. Squires looked deprecatingly at her hands. "We've all been turning in, putting up fox grapes." She included her husband and daughter with a comprehensive gesture. "And the stain just won't wash out. Has to wear off, you know." I spent perhaps 2 hours with my newfound friends, talking of everything from the best methods of potato culture to the surest way of landing a 9-pound bass. All three joined in the conversation and took a lively interest in the topics under discussion. After the vapid talk of the guest at the sanitarium, I found the simple, interested discourse of these country people as stimulating as wine, and when I left them, it was with a hearty promise to renew my call at an early date. "Better wait until after dark," Mr. Squires warned. "We'd be glad to see you any time, but we're so busy these fall days, we haven't much time for company." I took the broad hint in the same friendly spirit it was given. It must have grown chillier than I realized while I sat there, for my new friend's hands were clay cold when I took them in mine at parting. Homeward bound, a whimsical thought struck me so suddenly I laughed aloud. Ha ha ha! There was something suggestive of the dog tribe about the Squires family, though I could not, for the life of me, say what it was. Even Mildred, the daughter, beautiful as she was, with her light eyes, her rather prominent nose, and her somewhat wide mouth, reminded me, in some vague way, of a lovely silver collie I had owned as a boy. I struck a tassel of dried leaves from a cluster of weeds with my walking stick as I smiled at the fanciful conceit. The legend of the werewolf, those horrible monsters, formed as men, but capable of assuming bestial shape at will and killing and eating their fellows, was as old as mankind's fear of the dark. But no mythology I had ever read contained a reference to dog people. Strange fancies strike us in the moonlight sometimes. September ripened to October, and the moon, which had been as round and bright as an exchange-worn coin when I first visited the squire's house, waned as thin as a shaving from a silversmith's lathe. I became a regular caller at the house in the pines. Indeed, I grew to look forward to my nightly visits with those homely folk as a welcome relief from the tediously gay companionship of the over-sophisticated people at the sanitarium. My habit of slipping away shortly after dinner was the cause of considerable comment and no little speculation on the part of my fellow convalescents, some of whom set it down to the eccentricity which, to their minds, was the inevitable concomitant of a minister's vocation, while others were frankly curious. Snatches of conversation I overheard now and then led me to believe that the objective of my strolls was the subject of wagering, and the guarded questions put to me in an effort to solve the mystery became more and more annoying. I had no intention of taking any of them to the farmhouse with me. The squires were my friends. Their cheerful talk and unassuming manners were as delightful a contrast to the atmosphere of the sanitarium as a breath of mountain balsam after the fetid air of a hothouse. But to the city-centered crowd at Briarcliff, they would have been only the objects of less than half-scornful patronage, the source of pitying amusement. It was Miss Leahy who pushed the impudent curiosity further than any of the rest, however. One evening, as I was setting out, she met me at the gate and announced her intention of going with me.
"You must have found something dreadfully attractive to take you off every evening this way, Mr. Weatherby,"
she hazarded as she pursed her rather pretty, rouged lips at me and caught step with my walk.
"We girls really can't let some little country lass take you away from us, you know. We simply can't."
I made no reply. It was scarcely possible to tell a pretty girl, even such a vain little flirt as Sarah Leahy, to go home and mind her business. Yet that was just what I wanted to do. But I would not take her with me. To that, I made up my mind. I would stop at the turn of the road, just out of sight of the farmhouse, and cut across the fields. If she wanted to accompany me on a cross-country hike in high-heeled slippers, she was welcome to do so. Besides, she would tell the others that my wanderings were nothing more mysterious than nocturnal explorations of the nearby woods, which bit of misinformation would satisfy the busybodies at Briarcliff and relieve me of the espionage to which I was subjected as well. I smiled grimly to myself as I pictured her climbing over fences and ditches in her flimsy party frock and beaded pumps, and lengthened my stride toward the woods at the road's turn. We marched to the limits of the field bordering the squire's grove in silence, I thinking of the mild revenge I should soon wreak upon the pretty little busybody at my side. Miss Leahy, too intent on holding the pace I set to waste breath in conversation. As we neared the woods, she halted, an expression of worry, almost fear, coming over her face.
I don't believe I'll go any farther,
she announced. No, I replied, a trifle sarcastically. And is your curiosity so easily satisfied?
It's not that.
She turned half round as if to retrace her steps.
I'm afraid of those woods.
Indeed? I queried. And what is there to be afraid of? Bears? Indians? Or wildcats? I've been through them several times without seeing anything terrifying. Now she had come this far. I was anxious to take her through the fields and underbrush.
No,
Miss Leahy answered, a nervous quaver in her voice.
I'm not afraid of anything like that. But, I don't know what you call it. Pierre told me all about it the other day. Some kind of dreadful thing. Loop, something or other. It's a French word, and I can't remember it.
I was puzzled. Pierre Géronte was the ancient French-Canadian gardener at the sanitarium, and, like all doddering old men, would talk for hours to anyone who would listen. Also, like all habitants, he was full of the wild folklore his ancestors brought overseas with them generations ago. What did Pierre tell you? I asked.
Why, he said that years ago, some terrible people lived in these woods. They had the only house for miles round, and travelers stopped there for the night sometimes. But no stranger was ever seen to leave that place once he went in. One night the farmers gathered about the house and burned it with the family that lived there. When the embers had cooled down, they made a search and found nearly a dozen bodies buried in the cellar. That was why no one ever came away from that dreadful place. They took the murdered men to the cemetery and buried them. But they dumped the charred bodies of the murderers into graves in the barnyard without even saying a prayer over them. And Pierre says, "Oh, look!
She broke off her recital of the old fellow's story and pointed a trembling hand across the field to the edge of the woods. A second more, and she shrank against me, clutching at my coat with fear-stiffened fingers and crying with excitement and terror. I looked in the direction she indicated, myself a little startled by the abject fear that had taken such sudden hold on her. Something white and ungainly was running diagonally across the field from us, skirting the margin of the woods and making for the meadow that adjoined the sanitarium pasture. A second glance told me it was a sheep, probably one of the flock kept to supply our table with fresh meat. I was laughing at the strength of the superstition that could make the girl see a figure of horror in an innocent mutton that had strayed away from its fellows and was scared out of its silly wits, when something else attracted my attention. Loping along in the trail of the fleeing sheep, somewhat to the rear and a little to each side, were two other animals. At first glance, they appeared to be a pair of large collies, but as I looked more intently, I saw that these animals were like nothing I had ever seen before. They were much larger than any collie, nearly as high as St. Bernards, yet shaped in a general way like Alaskan sledge dogs, huskies. The farther one was considerably the larger of the two, and ran with a slight limp, as if one of its hind paws had been injured. As nearly as I could tell, in the indifferent light, they were a rusty brown color, very thick-haired and unkempt in appearance. But the strangest thing about them was the fact that both were tailless, which gave them a terrifyingly grotesque look. As they ran, a third form, similar to the other two in shape, but smaller, slender as a greyhound, with much lighter hued fur, broke from the thicket of short brush edging the wood and took up the chase, emitting a series of short, sharp yelps. "Sheep killers," I murmured half to myself. "Odd. I've never seen dogs like that before."
"They're not dogs,"
wailed Miss Leahy against my coat.
"They're not dogs. Oh, Mr. Weatherby, let's go away, please. Please take me home."
She was rapidly becoming hysterical, and I had a difficult time with her on the trip back. She clung whimpering to me, and I had almost to carry her most of the way. By the time we reached the sanitarium, she was crying bitterly, shivering as if with a chill, and went in without stopping to thank me for my assistance. I turned and made for the squire's farm with all possible speed, hoping to get there before the family had gone to bed. But when I arrived, the house was in darkness, and my knock at the door received no answer. As I retraced my steps to the sanitarium, I heard faintly from the fields beyond the woods the shrill, eerie cry of the sheep-killing dogs. A torrent of rain held us marooned the next day. Miss Leahy was confined to her room, with a nurse in constant attendance and the house doctor making hourly calls. She was on the verge of a nervous collapse, he told me, crying with a persistence that bordered on hysteria and responding to treatment very slowly. An impromptu dance was organized in the great hall and half a dozen bridge tables set up in the library. But as I was skilled in neither of these rainy day diversions, I put on a waterproof and patrolled the veranda for exercise. On my third or fourth trip around the house, I ran into old Geraint shuffling across the porch, wagging his head and muttering portentously to himself. "See here, Pierre," I accosted him. "What sort of nonsense have you been telling Miss Leahy about those pine woods down the south road?" The old fellow regarded me unwinkingly, with his beady eyes, wrinkling his age-yellowed forehead for all the world like an elderly baboon inspecting a new sort of edible. "Monsieur goes out alone much at nights, n'est-ce pas?" he asked at length. "Yes, Monsieur goes out alone much at night," I echoed. "But what Monsieur particularly desires to know is what sort of tales you have been telling Mademoiselle Leahy. Comprenez-vous?" The network of wrinkles about his lips multiplied as he smiled enigmatically, regarding me askance from the corners of his eyes. "Monsieur is Anglais," he replied. "He would not understand or believe." "Never mind what I'd believe," I retorted. "What is this story about murder and robbery being committed in those woods? Who were the murderers, and where did they live? Huh?" For a few seconds he looked fixedly at me, chewing the cud of senility between his toothless gums, then glancing carefully about as if he feared being overheard. He tiptoed up to me and whispered, "Monsieur Moose stay indoors these nights. When the moon she shine, yes? When she not show her face, no. There are evil things abroad at the dark of the moon, monsieur. Even last night, they killed 3 of my beast sheep. Remember, monsieur, the loup-garou, he is out when the moon hide her light." And with that he turned and left me. Nor could I get another word from him, save his cryptic warning. "Remember, monsieur, the loup-garou, remember." In spite of my annoyance, I could not get rid of the unpleasant sensation the old man's words left with me. The loup-garou, werewolf, he had said, and to prove his goblin wolf's presence, he had cited the death of his 3 sheep. As I paced the rain-washed porch, I thought of the scene I had witnessed the night before, when the sheep killers were at their work. Well, I reflected, I've seen the loup-garou on his native heath at last. From causes as slight as this, no doubt, the horrible legend of the werewolf had sprung. Time was when all France quaked at the sound of the loup-garou's hunting call, and the bravest knights in Christendom trembled in their castles and crossed themselves fearfully because some renegade shepherd dog quested his prey in the night. On such a foundation are the legends of a people built. Whistling a snatch from Pinafore and looking skyward in search of a patch of blue in the clouds, I felt a tug at my raincoat sleeve, such as a neglected terrier might give. It was Geraint again.
Monsieur,
He began in the same mysterious whisper.
the loup-garou is a verity, certainly. I myself have never seen him.
He paused to bless himself.
But my cousin, Baptiste, was once pursued by him. Yes, it was near the shrine of the good Saint Anne that Baptiste lived. One night he was sent to fetch the curé for a dying woman. They rode fast through the trees, the curé and my cousin, Baptiste, for it was at the dark of the moon, and the evil forest folk were abroad. As they galloped, there came a loup-garou from the woods, with eyes as bright as hellfire. It followed hard, this tailless hound, from the devil's kennel. But they reached the house before it, and the curé put his book, with the Holy Cross on its cover, at the doorstep. The loup-garou wailed under the windows like a child in pain until the sun rose. Then it slunk back to the forest. When my cousin Baptiste and the curé came out, they found its hand marks in the soft earth around the door. Very like your hand, or mine, they were. Monsieur, save that the first finger was longer than the others.
And did they find the loup-garou? I asked. Something of the old man's earnestness communicated to me.
Yes, monsieur, but of course,
he replied gravely.
3 weeks before a stranger drowned in the river had been buried without the office of the church. When they opened his grave, they found his fingernails as red as blood and sharp. Then they knew. The good curé read the burial office over him, and the poor soul that had been snatched away in sin slept peacefully at last.
He looked quizzically at me, as if speculating whether to tell me more. Then, apparently fearing I would laugh at his outburst of confidence, started away toward the kitchen. Well, what else, Pierre? I asked, feeling he had more to say.
No,
He replied.
There is nothing more, monsieur. I did but want monsieur should know my own cousin, that is Geraint, had seen the loup-garou with his very eyes.
Hearsay evidence, I commented as I went in to dinner. During the rainy week that followed, I chafed at my confinement, like a privileged convict suddenly deprived of his liberties, and looked as wistfully down the south road as any prisoned gypsy ever gazed upon the open trail. The quiet home circle at the farmhouse, the unforced conversation of the old folks, Mildred's sweet companionship, all beckoned me with an almost irresistible force. For in this period of enforced separation, I discovered what I had dimly suspected for some time. I loved Mildred Squires, and, loving her, I longed to tell her of it. No lad intent on visiting his first sweetheart, ever urged his feet more eagerly than I when, the curtains of rain at last drawn up, I hastened toward the house at the turn of the road. As I hoped, yet hardly dared expect, Mildred was standing at the gate to meet me as I rounded the curve, and I yearned toward her like a hummingbird seeking its nest. She must have read my heart in my eyes, for her greeting smile was as tender as a mother's as she bends above her babe.
At last you have come, my friend,
she said, putting out both hands in welcome.
I am very glad.
We walked silently up the path, her fingers still resting in mine, her face averted. At the steps, she paused, a little embarrassment in her voice as she explained.
Father and Mother are out. They have gone to a meeting. But you will stay?
Surely, I acquiesced, and to myself I admitted my gratitude for this chance of Mildred's unalloyed company. We talked but little that night. Mildred was strangely distrait, and, much as I longed to, I could not force a confession of my love from my lips. Once, in the midst of a long pause between our words, the cry of the sheep killers came faintly to us, echoed across the fields and woods, and as the weird, shrill sound fell on our ears, she threw back her head with something of the gesture of a hunting dog scenting its quarry. Toward midnight, she turned to me, a panic of fear having apparently laid hold of her.
You must go,
she exclaimed, rising and laying her hand on my shoulder. But your father and mother have not returned, I objected. Won't you let me stay until they get back?
Oh, no, no,
she answered, her agitation increasing.
You must go at once, please.
She increased her pressure on my shoulder, almost as if to shove me from the porch. Taken aback by her sudden desire to be rid of me, I was picking up my hat when she uttered a stifled little scream and ran quickly to the edge of the porch, interposing herself between me and the yard. At the same moment, I heard a muffled sound from the direction of the front gate, a sound like a growling and snarling of savage dogs. I leaped forward, my first thought being that the sheep killers I had seen the other night had strayed to the squire's place. Crazed with blood, I knew they would be almost as dangerous to men as to sheep, and every nerve in my sickness-weakened body cried out to protect Mildred. To my blank amazement, as I looked from the porch, I beheld Mr. and Mrs. Squires walking sedately up the path, talking composedly together. There was no sign of the dogs or any other animals about. As the elderly couple neared the porch, I noticed that Mr. Squires walked with a pronounced limp, and that both their eyes shone very brightly in the moonlight, as though they were suffused with tears. They greeted me pleasantly enough, but Mildred's anxiety seemed increased rather than diminished by their presence, and I took my leave after a brief exchange of civilities. On my way back, I looked intently in the woods bordering the road for some sign of the house of which Pierre had told Miss Leahy, but everywhere the pines grew as thickly as thought. Neither axe nor fire had ever disturbed them. Geraint is in his second childhood, I reflected, and like an elder child, he loves to terrify his juniors with fearsome witch tales. Yet, an uncomfortable feeling was with me till I saw the gleam of the sanitarium's lights across the fields, and as I walked toward them, It seemed to me that more than once I heard the baying of the sheep killers in the woods behind me. A buzz of conversation, like the sibilant arguments of a cloud of swarming bees, greeted me as I descended the stairs to breakfast next morning. It appeared that Ned, one of the pair of great mastiffs attached to the sanitarium, had been found dead before his kennel, his throat and brisket torn open, and several gaping wounds in his flanks. Boris, his fellow, had been discovered whimpering and trembling in the extreme corner of the doghouse, the embodiment of canine terror. Speculation as to the animal responsible for the outrage was rife, and, as usual, it ran the gamut of possible and impossible surmises. Every sort of beast, from a grizzly bear to a lion escaped from the circus, was in turn indicted for the crime, only to have a complete alibi straightway established. The only one having no suggestion to offer was old Geraint, who stood sphinx-like in the outskirts of the crowd, smiling sardonically to himself and wagging his head sagely. As he caught sight of me, he nodded sapiently, as if to include me in the joint tenancy to some weighty secret. Presently he worked his way through the chattering group and whispered,
"Monsieur, he was here last night, and with him was the other tailless one. Come and see."
Plucking me by the sleeve, he led me to the rear of the kennels, and stooping pointed to something in the moist earth.
"You see?"
he asked, as if a printed volume lay for my reading in the mud. "I see that someone has been on his hands and knees here," I answered, inspecting the handprints he indicated.
"Something?"
he corrected, as if reasoning with an obstinate child.
"Does not Monsieur behold that the first finger is the longest?"
"Which proves nothing," I defended. "There are many hands like that."
"Oh, yes,"
he replied with that queer upward accent of his.
"And where has Monsieur seen hands like that before?"
"Oh, many times," I assured him, somewhat vaguely, for there was a catch at the back of my throat as I spoke. Try as I would, I could recall only 3 pairs of hands with that peculiarity. His little black eyes rested steadily on me in an unwinking stare, and the corners of his mouth curved upward in a malicious grin. It seemed almost as if he found a grim pleasure in thus driving me into a corner. "See here, Pierre," I began testily, equally annoyed at myself and him. "You know as well as I that the loup-garou is an old woman's tale. Someone was looking here for tracks and left his own while doing it. If we look among the patients here, we shall undoubtedly find a pair of hands to match these prints."
"God forbid!"
he exclaimed, crossing himself.
"That would be an evil day for us, Monsieur." "Here, Boris,"
he snapped his fingers to the surviving mastiff. "Come and eat." The huge beast came wallowing over to him with the ungainly gait of all heavily muscled animals, stopping on his way to make a nasal investigation of my knees. Scarcely had his nose come into contact with my trousers when he leaped back, every hair in his mane and along his spine stiffly erect, every tooth in his great mouth bared in a savage snarl. But instead of the mastiff's fighting growl, he emitted only a low, frightened whine, as though he were facing some animal of greater power than himself, and knew his own weakness. "Good heavens!" I cried, thoroughly terrified at the friendly brute's sudden hostility.
"Yes, Monsieur,"
Geraint cut in quickly, putting his hand on the dog's collar and leading him a few paces away.
"It is well.
you should call upon the heavenly ones, for surely you have the odor of hell upon your clothes."
"What do you mean?" I demanded angrily. "How dare you?" He raised a thin hand deprecatingly.
"Monsieur knows that he knows," he replied evenly, "and what I also know."
And leading Boris by the collar, he shuffled to the house. Mildred was waiting for me at the gate that evening, and again her father and mother were absent at one of their meetings. We walked silently up the path and seated ourselves on the porch steps, where the waning moon cast oblique rays through the pine branches. I think Mildred felt the tension I was drawn to, for she talked trivialities with an almost feverish earnestness, stringing her sentences together and changing her subjects as a Navajo rug weaver twists and breaks her threads. At last, I found an opening in the abatis of her small talk. "Mildred," I said very simply, for great emotions tear the ornaments from our speech, "I love you, and I want you for my wife. Will you marry me, Mildred?" I laid my hand on hers. It was cold as lifeless flesh and seemed to shrink beneath my touch. "Surely, dear, you must have read the love in my eyes," I urged as she averted her face in silence. "Almost from the night I first saw you, I've loved you, dear. Oh, don't." Her interruption was a strangled moan, as if wrung from her by my words. I leaned nearer her. "Don't you love me, Mildred?" I asked. As yet, she had not denied it. For a moment, she trembled, as if a sudden chill had come on her. Then, leaning to me, she clasped my shoulders in her arms, hiding her face against my jacket. John, you don't know what you say," she whispered disjointedly, as though a sob had torn the words before they left her lips. Her breath was on my cheek, moist and cold as air from a vault. I could feel the litheness of her through the thin stuff of her gown, and her body was as devoid of warmth as a dead thing. "You're cold," I told her, putting my arms shieldingly about her. "The night has chilled you." A convulsive sob was her only answer. "Mildred," I began again, putting my hand beneath her chin and lifting her face to mine. "Tell me, dear, what is the matter?" I lowered my lips to hers. With a cry that was half scream, half weeping, she thrust me suddenly from her, pressing her hands against my breast and lowering her head until her face was hidden between her outstretched arms. I, too, started back, for in the instant our lips were about to meet, hers had writhed back from her teeth like a dog's when he is about to spring, and a low, harsh noise, almost a growl, had risen in her throat. "For God's sake," she whispered hoarsely, agony in every note of her shaking voice. "Never do that again! Oh, my dear love, you don't know how near to a horror worse than death you were." Horror? Worse than death? I echoed dully, pressing her cold little hands in mine. "What do you mean, Mildred?" "Loose my hands," she commanded, with a quaint reversion to the speech of our ancestors. "And hear me. I do love you. I love you better than life, better than death. I love you so I have overcome something stronger
than the walls of the grave for your sake. But John, my very love, this is our last night together. We can never meet again. You must go now and not come back until tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning? I repeated blankly. What wild talk was this? Heedless of my interruption, she hurried on.
Tomorrow morning, just before the sun rises over those trees, you must be here and have your prayer book with you.
I listened, speechless, wondering which of us was mad.
By that corn crib there,
she waved a directing hand.
You will find 3 mounds. Stand beside them and read the office for the burial of the dead. Come quickly and pause for nothing on the way. Look back for nothing. Heed no sound from behind you. And for your own safety, come no sooner than to allow yourself the barest time to read your office.
Bewildered, I attempted to reason with the mad woman, begged her to explain this folly, but she refused all answer to my fervent queries, nor would she suffer me to touch her. Finally, I rose to go.
You will do what I ask?
She implored. Certainly not, I answered firmly.
John, have pity,
she cried, flinging herself to the earth before me and clasping my knee.
You say you love me. I only ask this one favor of you, only this. Please, for my sake, for the peace of the dead and the safety of the living, promise you will do this thing for me.
Shaken by her abject supplication, I promised, though I felt myself a figure in some grotesque nightmare as I did it.
Oh, my love, my precious love,
she wept, rising and taking both my hands.
At last I shall have peace, and you shall bring it to me.
No, she forbade, as I made to take her in my arms at parting.
The most I can give you, dear, is this.
She held her icy hands against my lips.
It seems so little, dear, but oh, it is so much.
Like a drunkard in his cups, I staggered along the south road, my thoughts going wild with the strangeness of the play I had just acted. Across the clearing came the howls of the sheep killers, a sound I had grown used to of late. But tonight, there was a deeper, fiercer timbre in their bay, a note that boded ill for man as well as beast. Louder and louder it swelled. It was rising from the field itself, now drawing nearer and nearer the road. I turned and looked. The great beast I had seen pursuing the luckless sheep the other night were galloping toward me. A cold finger seemed traced down my spine. The scalp crept and tingled beneath my cap. There was no other object of their quest in sight. I was their elected prey. My first thought was to turn and run, but a second's reasoning told me this was worse than useless. Weakened with long illness, with an uphill road to the nearest shelter, I should soon be run down. No friendly tree offered asylum. My only hope was to stand and fight. Grasping my stick, I spread my feet, bracing myself against their charge. And as I waited their onslaught, there came from the shadow of the pines the shriller sharper cry of the third beast, like the crest of a flying, wind-lashed wave. The slighter, silver-furred brute came speeding across the meadow, its ears laid back, its slender paws spurning the sod daintily. Almost it seemed as if the pale shadow of a cloud were racing toward me. The thing dashed slantwise across the field, its flight converging on the line of the other two's attack. Midway between me and them, it paused, hairs bristling, limbs bent for a spring. My eyes went wide with incredulity. It was standing in my defense. All the savageness of the larger beast hunting cry was echoed in the smaller creature's bay, and with it, a defiance that needed no interpretation. The attackers paused in their rush, halted, and looked speculatively at my ally. They took a few tentative steps in my direction, and a fierce whine, almost an articulate curse, went up from the silver-haired beast. Slowly, the tawny pair circled and trotted back to the woods. I hurried toward the sanitarium, grasping my stick firmly in readiness for another attack. But no further cries came from the woods, and once, as I glanced back, I saw the light-haired beast trotting slowly in my wake, looking from right to left, as if to ward off danger. Half an hour later, I looked from my window toward the house in the pines. Far down the south road, its muzzle pointed to the moon. The bright-furred animal crouched and poured out a lament to the night, and its cry was like the wail of a child in pain. Far into the night, I paced my room, like a condemned convict when the vigil of the death watch is on him. Reason and memory struggled for the mastery, one urging me to give over my wild act, the other bidding me obey my promise to Mildred. Toward morning, I dropped into a chair, exhausted with my objectless marching. I must have fallen asleep, for when I started up, the stars were dimming in the zenith, and bands of slate, shading to amethyst, slanted across the horizon. A moment I paused, laughing cynically at my fool's errand, then seizing cap and book, I bolted down the stairs and ran through the paling dawn to the house in the pines. There was something ominous and terrifying in the two-tone pastel of the house that morning. Its windows stared at me with blank malevolence, like the half-closed eyes of one stricken dead in mortal sin. The little patches of hoarfrost on the lawn were like leprous spots on some unclean thing. From the trees behind the clearing, an owl hooted mournfully, as if to say, "Beware! Beware!" And the wind soughing through the black pine boughs echoed the refrain ceaselessly. 3 mounds, sunken and weed-grown, lay in the unkempt thicket behind the corn crib. I paused beside them, throwing off my cap and adjusting my stole hastily. Thumbing the pages to the committal service, I held the book close, that I might see the print through the morning shadows, and commenced, "I know that my Redeemer liveth." Almost beside me, under the branches of the pines, there rose such a chorus of howls and yelps, I nearly dropped my book. Like all the hounds in the kennels of hell, the sheep-killers clamored at me, raging fear and mortal hatred in their cries. Through the bestial cadences, too, there seemed to run a human note, the sound of voices heard before beneath these very trees, deep and throaty and raging mad. 2 of the voices came to me and, like the tremolo of a violin lightly played in an orchestra of brass, the shriller cry of a third beast sounded. As the infernal hubbub rose at my back, I half turned to fly. Next instant, I grasped my book more firmly and resumed my office. For like a beacon in the dark, Mildred's words flashed on my memory.
Look back for nothing. Heed no sound behind you.
Strangely, too, the den approached no nearer, but as though held by an invisible bar, stayed at the boundary of the clearing. Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. Deliver us from all our offenses. O Lord, deliver us not into the bitter pains of eternal death. And to such an accompaniment, surely, as no priest ever before chanted the office, I pressed through the brief service to the final Amen. Tiny gouts of moisture stood out on my forehead. My breath struggled in my throat as I gasped out the last word. My nerves were frayed to shreds, and my strength nearly gone as I let fall my book and turned upon the beast among the trees. They were gone. Abruptly, as it had begun, their clamor stopped, and only the rotting pine needles, lightly gilded by the morning sun, met my gaze. A light touch fell in the palm of my open hand, as if a pair of cool, sweet lips had laid a kiss there. A vapor like swamp fog enveloped me. The outbuildings, the old, stone-curbed well where I had drunk the night I first saw Mildred, the house itself, all seemed fading into mist and swirling away in the morning breeze. Hey, but Monsieur will do himself an injury sleeping on the wet earth. Ogerant bent over me, his arm beneath my shoulders. Behind him, great Boris, the mastiff, stood wagging his tail, regarding me with doggish good humor. Pierre, I muttered thickly, how came you here? This morning, going to my task, I saw Monsieur run down the road like a thing pursued. I followed quickly, for the woods hold terrors in the dark, Monsieur. I looked toward the farmhouse. Only a pair of chimneys, rising stark and bare from a crumbling foundation, were there. Fence, well, barn, all were gone, and in their place a thicket of sumac and briars, tangled and overgrown, as though undisturbed for 30 years. The house, Pierre! Where is the house? I croaked, sinking my fingers into his withered arm. House? He echoed. Oh, but of course, there is no house here, Monsieur, nor has there been for years. This is an evil place, Monsieur. It is best we quit it, and that quickly. There be evil things that run by night. No more, I answered, staggering toward the road, leaning heavily on him. I brought them peace, Pierre. He looked dubiously at the English prayer book I held. A Protestant clergyman is a thing of doubtful usefulness to the Orthodox French Canadian. Something of the heart-sick misery in my face must have touched his kind old heart, for at last he relented, shaking his head pityingly and patting my shoulder gently as one would soothe a sorrowing child. Perhaps, Monsieur, he conceded. Perhaps. Who shall say no? Love and sorrow are the purchase price of peace. Yes, did not Le Bon Dieu so buy the peace of the world? Flowers from the Moon by Robert Bloch. Quote, the hands were claws, and the body was furry and shaggy. 1 minute, there was nothing in the clear blue depths of the sky. The next, streaking across the far horizon like a silver comet, the great ship appeared, roaring down to earth. With anxious eyes, I watched it fall as the roaring intensified. With a sense of relief, I heard the sound diminish, even as the speed of the dropping spaceship diminished. They had shut off the propulsion successfully. The last danger had passed. Now the vessel seemed to drift toward Earth. I ran back to my car, raced the motor, and shot down the road toward the west. The ship would land in the plain about 3 miles distant. I calculated. As I sped toward the spot, my eyes scanned the silver hull, and I sighed with relief as I noted that it seemed undented, unblemished. Cars behind me hooted horns. The reporters were here too. I pressed my foot down hard and shot up to 80, then 90. Ahead of me, the ship was pulling to rest, easing gently down upon the smooth turf of a meadow. It landed. I put on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. Then, with my heart thumping and thundering in my chest, I ran across the grass toward the ship, toward the silver door. Edna, I murmured. Edna! Of course, my voice could not be heard through the insulated duro-aluminum walls of the spaceship, but it was almost magic to see the door slowly open in response to my cry, and it was magic when she stepped into the doorway, lovelier than the images of my dreams during the past 2 months. She hesitated, blinking in the sun that flamed through her auburn hair, gazed at the ground 6 feet beneath the base of the doorway. Then I held out my arms, and she leaped, and we were locked together in an embrace that freed me of all the anxious longing and heart-sick worry of the past 8 weeks. Edna, you're safe, alive, I whispered tenderly. Oh, Terry, I knew you'd find us. Your father, Charles, the captain, are they all right? The blue eyes clouded in momentary confusion. Yes, she whispered, but... The sentence was never finished. The reporters were on us, literally on us from all sides. The cars straggled in, cameras clicked. Sorry, Miss Jackson? Picture? Hold it, please. Your father safe? Get to the moon? Miss Jackson? Gonna marry this young man? Edna's white hands tugged at my shoulder. Terry, do something. Let father and the others get away from these men. They're too tired to talk now. And besides, Charles isn't well. For answer, I fought my way through the struggling swarm of reporters and climbed into my car. Deliberately, I wheeled around and drove straight at the babbling horde. The reporters scattered as I skidded to a stop directly under the ship's doorway. By this time, a rope ladder had been let down from this ship, and now Professor Jackson appeared. His tired eyes blinked nervously, and one hand went to his white head as he took in the scene. He descended the ladder and seated himself in the car. Then the captain appeared. Not the fat Captain Zurich I remembered, but a thinner, haggard-looking man. He carried a great satchel in one hand. He paused in the doorway to shout into the depths of the ship. He scowled and slowly descended. Halfway down, he paused again and reached up to shut the door, but the door opened. A figure appeared then. It was Charles DeVoe, my rival. Charles the Suave, Charles the Laughing, the Debonair, the black-haired, sleek, handsome scientist. So, I remembered Charles. This man was different, horribly different. His face was dead white, and his black hair bristled down almost to his eyebrows. His features seemed oddly altered. The shadows of the sun seemed to have lengthened his nose and chin. His hands went to his face, and they seemed thin as claws. And when the hands came away, I saw his red eyes. They glared, and his mouth grinned. That mouth, it hung open, working, a crimson maw of drooling imbecility. Charles DeVoe was mad. The captain looked up. "Go back," he shouted. "Charles, go back." Charles opened his mouth and snarled. I have never heard such a sound from a human throat. The yelling reporters quieted about the car, and then Charles came down. He didn't climb down, he leaped. "What's wrong with him?" shouted an excited little man who climbed on the running board as the captain took his seat. "Hey buddy, what's the matter?" Charles leaped and landed, not on the running board, but on the shoulders of the little man. With a sound I can only describe as a growl, Charles bore the small reporter, screaming, to the ground. His hands clawed at the little man's throat, and his mouth gaped open. Then he snarled, put his mouth to the reporter's throat, and bit. Edna was shuddering at my side, and the professor was screaming something in a high, hysterical voice. The reporters were tugging at Charles, pulling him away. I tried to free myself, but Edna clung to me, sobbing. The captain acted. With a single gesture, he pulled out a revolver and fired. There was a moan, and Charles fell backward, hands clawing the air, fell backward from the bleeding horror of the little man's torn neck. And then the captain heaved the crumpled figure of Charles into the car and snapped, "Drive, Terry! Drive like hell!" I did. We were safe at last in the laboratory, safe from the screaming headlines. Jackson returns from moon. Jackson's daughter returns from moon voyage to wed. Madman in Jackson's lunar party attacks reporter. We were safe in the laboratory, and Captain Zurich had gone back to remove the party's effects from the spaceship. The professor and Edna sat beside me in the room, while upstairs Charles DeVoe tossed and moaned with a bullet through his shoulder. "Tell me," Professor Jackson began, "have you kept the charts?" I nodded, a bit ruefully, I must confess. It was something of a sore point with me. Those charts and records of the voyage I had astronomically recorded while they were away. It dated back 5 years ago to my college days, when I worked with the professor in his laboratory, became his intimate, and then his assistant. During those years, I met and learned to love his daughter Edna. And during those years in my life, like his own, was centered about his plans for a voyage to the moon. We'd gone over the construction of the vessel together. Then, Dr. Charles DeVoe had come as assistant. He designed the actual spaceship while I plotted the course by astronomy. Edna had helped me, and we had all worked with but a single goal for years: the voyage to the moon and return. When the trial ships we sent up exploded or disappeared forever, we had suffered the keen pangs of disappointed dreams. Then, Captain Zurich had come from Moscow to perfect our plans and finance the venture. The voyage was about to begin. But when it came to selecting the passengers, the professor omitted me. The captain, Charles DeVoe, Edna, and himself had gone. I was forced to stay behind and keep the records. A bookkeeper of astronomy, I reflected bitterly. Up there in the solar blue, my future bride rode with my nearest rival, while I could not share her perils. It had been a bitter pill for me to swallow, to wait, to gaze each night in agony at the cold moon, wondering where she was, whether I'd ever hold her in my arms again. It was hell on earth, those 8 anxious weeks. The papers had scoffed, called us all mad for our scheme, despite the validity of our plans we gave them. That had added to my worries. Was it, after all, an impossible scheme? I wondered through sleepless nights. But now they had returned. There were 1,000 questions I must ask. What had they found? Was there life on the moon, as the professor had always staunchly maintained? What was the temperature, the nature of the soil, the effect of gravity? And what had made a drooling madman out of Charles DeVoe? I asked those questions now, and the professor answered, while Edna sat at my side, her eyes alight with a strange, unspoken fear. The voyage had been calm enough as planned. Captain Zur had handled the ship nicely. The propulsion devices had worked smoothly. The insulation had been perfect and the air conditioning sound. Food capsule supplies had held out. The speed had been calculated properly. The automatic direction steering had proved practical. The actual voyage took a little over 3 weeks each way. It spent 4 days actually on the surface of the moon. The figures, exact detailed reports were all here. The instruments were to be unlocked and their findings checked and recorded. The voyage had proved a brilliant success. But why was Professor Jackson so haggard? Why did his hands tremble so when he spoke of the voyage home? Why didn't he begin with his old-time enthusiasm to recount the story of his days on the moon? Why did Edna draw closer to me as though in fear? These questions flashed through my brain. What's your actual experiences on the moon, Professor? I asked. What did you bring back with you? Terry, I'd rather not go into that just yet. I'm tired, my boy. The professor's words came too hastily. Don't ask about that, dear. It's something you better not know, Edna whispered. But I've a right to know, I snapped angrily. You made me sit here and eat my heart out, my heart that belongs to you and the plan for years. Now I have a right to know what happened on that voyage, to know what made a lunatic out of Charles DeVoe. Lunatic? The professor breathed the words. Lunacy. Madness caused by the moon. The old definition was right. Yes. And that other definition. Father, please, Edna begged. The professor looked at me. No, Edna. He has a right to know. As he said, he must know about what we found and about Charles. Because we'll have to do something right away. He rose to his feet as I watched him and went over to a table on which rested the big satchel the captain had brought with him. Without a word, he opened it and motioned me over. I went to his side and looked down at what he drew forth. His hands were filled with flowers, white, orchid-like flowers, waxen as the face of death, and lovely as pearls. The ivory pearls hung open on scarlet depths, unblossomed, and as the professor stroked the thick white cups, they seemed to tremble, rising and falling like the flesh of a woman's throat as she breathes. And they were lovely, lovely past all imagining. We brought these back to Earth, the professor said. We found them on the second day when we descended into the crater. We had seen no life in the barren soil, but we descended into this deep crater and found them growing at the bottom, near the mouths of the caves. I listened but scarcely heard, so intently was I studying the white and scarlet blossoms. We plucked them. Charles carried them back with him, and he put them away. His voice sounded from a great distance. We didn't know then, but that night, as they lay on a shelf in the ship, we had the dreams, and we heard the howling. Waking, I realized for the first time that these flowers had a scent. A scent! Abruptly, I jerked myself into awareness. That was it. That was why I couldn't hear, couldn't see. The flowers had a scent. It was a scent so subtle, so delicate. I had not known that I was inhaling it. and it was a scent so powerful that I could scarcely stand. It was a scent so strong that my olfactory nerves blotted out consciousness of their faculties. I could only smell, could no longer hear or see or feel. It was an indescribable scent, but terribly sweet, so sweet it hurt my eyes and throat, and burned in my brain with lovely white fire. I fought to awaken as I stood there, reeling before the strange white flowers from the moon. And then I saw once more, saw that my breath was coming in rhythm to the pulsing of the flowers. "Terry!" Edna's voice called from far away. "Wake up, Terry!" But I didn't want to awaken. I wanted to drown in that sweetness, let that scent flood my veins and surge up in white fire. My closed eyes saw waving blossoms, and I was suddenly in a deep black pit on the surface of the moon where flowers nodded in the darkness and bent toward me, blossoming. Their hungry red mouths like the avid ruby lips of vampires. I was bending toward them. "Terry!" Edna's arms, her voice brought me to my senses. "What are these accursed things?" I gasped. The professor shook his head gravely. "I do not know. Though it affects one strongly at first. I'm used to it now, I think. But that first night, we all had queer dreams, and I remember waking from my slumber to stare at the glass door of the ship. The glass, temporary door we affixed after landing. I could see eyes in the doorway, great red eyes, like the eyes of a wolf. And then we all awoke and heard the howling, the dreadful wolfish howling. God, I'll never forget the way." "What's that?" I shouted the interruption. The ghastly sound rose on wings of nightmare dread, sweeping down from the room upstairs. It was a sound that made the short hairs rise on my neck. It caused my throat to go dry with sudden, unnameable fear. It was the sound all men instinctively dread, the horrible, deep-throated baying of a wolf. And it came from within the house. "Charles!" shouted the professor. "Come on!" He raced from the room and plunged up the stairs, while I pounded at his heels. Edna tried to hold me back, but I brushed her arm away. The professor, his face frantic with alarm, ran down the hall and jerked open the door of a bedroom where Charles had been placed. I followed swiftly, entered behind him. Too late. For as the door opened, the horror sprang. The professor went down, and then the thing was at his throat, tearing and tearing with that monstrous growl rising from a fanged maw as it bit and snapped. I staggered back, my eyes blurring at the enormity of the dread I saw before me. It was not Charles DeVoe attacking Professor Jackson. DeVoe had disappeared. He was not in the room. There was no Charles DeVoe anymore. There was a wolf. The face I thought lengthened in the sunlight shadows was now completely gone. It was a snout, a furry, rimmed, gleaming muzzle with wicked red jaws from which the long yellow fangs protruded. The claw-like hands were claws, and the naked body was furry and shaggy as a gigantic wolf's body is shaggy. That nightmare metamorphosis had occurred. And now this thing tore at the professor's helpless throat. Then it looked up at me and snarled and sprang. I flung up my arms to shield myself from the ripping talons. One hand struck against the coarse hair of the beast's shoulder, and the lupine creature yelped with pain. My hand had touched the wolf's shoulder, where it bled from a bullet wound which Charles DeVoe had sustained. Whining with pain, the animal swerved aside and sprang past me, out the door. It scuffled down the stairs, and I raced after it. Edna was in the laboratory. I sighed with relief as the thing continued on, out the open door. In my daze, I didn't realize that the horror was escaping, loosing itself on the world. Only thought was for Edna's safety. I turned back up the stairs, but it was too late. One glimpse of the falling professor, and I knew it was all over. Mercifully, I covered the torn features and hurried down the stairs. Edna, sobbing, fell into my arms. I tried to speak. "Oh, Terry. I know, she murmured. "Father's gone." And it was Charles. "Did he get away?" I nodded. And then Edna showed the stuff that she was made of. Her eyes cleared, her voice became firm. "We must act at once," she said. "Terry, you're the only one who can save us from it." I held her close. "It was my fault. I should have made Father tell you everything at the first. I will tell you now." She spoke swiftly, urgently. "Those flowers. I have a theory about them, Terry. Have you ever read those old books in Father's library? Those ones on witchcraft and demonology he collected?" I looked up, comprehending. "Yes. He was a serious student of occultism, remember? I used to argue with him as to whether there weren't actually distorted scientific truths in old superstitions and legends that strangely persisted in every age and every country. He said that perhaps these legends had a basis in truth and a scientific meaning man just hadn't learned to interpret yet. And I think he was right because of this." She paused for breath, then hurried on. "Those books speak of werewolves, remember? Legend that men sometimes alter their shape to that of beasts. Under the influence of some drugs, the books say, minds of men change. That's true. It's regularly accepted science. Opium, various narcotics do that to your mind. They are made from flowers, remember? And the old books say that there are other drugs, rarer ones, that alter not the mind, but the body. They say that in certain valleys of the Orient, where the moon shines always, there grows a curious white flower, which blossoms under the full moon. The books say that those who breathe the scent of this flower change their bodies and become wolves, werewolves. Only a silver bullet slays them once they breathe the scent of these strange, rare flowers that legends say grow from seeds that drift in space, seeds that come from the moon." When she paused for breath, I spoke hesitantly. "You mean that?" "Yes, Terry. Don't you see? And those other medical theories of olden days about lunatics, people who go mad when the moon is full. The moon influenced their minds, those ancient savants believed. The moon is a strange thing, Terry. It's a weird world that controls much on Earth. It affects our tides, influences our seasons. Why not our minds? The old faiths that worship the moon were aware of long forgotten truths. These white flowers that grow on the moon, you smelled them, and you know what happened to your own mind. It's true. But Charles DeVoe, what did he do? We were asleep that first night after plucking the flowers. Their scent filled the ship, although we didn't know it then. And the howling awoke Father. He saw the wolf outside. It howled. And Charles began to howl in return. It was horrible. Father and Captain Zert knew at once that he had gone mad somehow. We strapped him to the bed, but he was raving about flowers, about how he had sat there poring over them all evening. We didn't listen to him then, thinking that he babbled in delirium brought on by some strangeness in the lunar air or by the rigors of the trip. But the wolf howled outside, and Charles raved about the white flowers and a change within his blood, and how he felt his body going wrong. That was the worst, Terry. Charles guessed what the truth was, and we didn't heed. The wolf vanished. Father went back to the craters again, though I begged him to leave at once. But he was so excited about the possibility of life on this dead planet, particularly such a high form as canine life. He theorized as to how this particular form managed to maintain its existence. He searched for hours. When he came back, he was pale, stricken, and aged. Charles was worse. straining at his bonds and howling continuously. We put the flowers away, still not believing in their potency, and we started back. The return voyage was terrible. Charles began to change visibly. My father and the captain argued until they hit on the truth. The wolves on the moon must have once been men, but the flowers of lycanthropism had changed them into wolves who howled in pits, just as poor Charles howled for blood. We landed, hoping to keep Charles confined until we could move him secretly. Father wanted to study his lycanthropy as a disease, cure him if possible, but Charles knew. Even though he could no longer speak, he knew, and he gnawed through his bonds and tried to escape. When he bit the reporter, Captain Zurich shot him, but ordinary bullets won't kill a werewolf. And now he has killed Father. Edna laid her head on my shoulder and shuddered. We must find him, Terry. He's loose on the world now, and he'll seek blood wherever he goes. Those things live on, and the flowers will change others too. We must destroy those flowers first of all. All the blossoms must be burned until the evil scent is gone forever. No, you don't. A deep voice barked through the room. Both of us turned to see the set face of Captain Zurich. I looked at that face, then into the staring muzzle of a revolver. Lucky I arrived in time, the captain said. Just listen to what I say and keep your hands at your side. I don't want trouble. Edna looked curiously at the captain. But the professor's dead, she faltered. Charles escaped. That's no concern of mine, snapped the captain. I'm interested in the flowers, not saving a few worthless lives. This flower cluster came from the moon. Don't be fools. It has incalculable scientific value. It is a form of lunar life and must be studied. Science can learn so much from it that should be known. You must not destroy it in childish, superstitious dread. But DeVoe is out, and he'll kill, I argued. The gun waved to silence me. Stop talking like a schoolboy. What if he is? He'll be captured in due time and captured alive, too. He must be studied now as well. You're mad, I shouted. Crazy, a fanatic. Science or no science, there's a horror in these blossoms that must be destroyed to save humanity. His bite will kill many, but it will merely infect others, like rabies from a dog. It will work in their blood until they too become living dead animals that raven to kill. The world will be filled with snarling horrors, werewolves. They'll destroy all men. You saw what happened on the moon. It can happen here. Whole cities of baying wolves howling at the moon. You can't want that. I don't care. I'm taking these flowers now. I glanced at the windows. It was dark outside and the moon was already rising. Night was falling, and somewhere in the blackness that loping thing waited to kill. Red tongue lolling, gleaming jaws agape. The papers from the ship, the instruments, I asked, stalling for time to think. I brought them here, said Captain Zurich. They're safe in the house. All your precious secrets. The vessel's been checked too. You'll find it in readiness for a return voyage, if you like. That doesn't interest me. I stalled off the reporters and the police about the shooting this afternoon. They won't be around till morning. I didn't want anything to hinder my plans. These plans leave with me tonight for Moscow. I shall study them at my leisure with my own staff. Edna moved away, but the captain saw her. Don't try anything foolish, girl. I'll shoot you without hesitating, I assure you. Now, I'll take the flowers and go. He scooped them up from the table. For a moment, one great hand clutched the mass of white, evil blossoms. His nostrils flared as he inhaled the cloying scent. His eyes narrowed. Exquisite, he murmured, half to himself. They bring me dreams. I dreamed on the voyage back, dreamed of them. Now they shall be mine. Their perfume mine to breathe. I shall inhale all beauty and all strangeness. He's mad, Edna whispered to me. He's mad. The story is insane. He doesn't want the flowers for scientific reasons, but because they've begun to bewitch him. The sin is starting to change him, as it did poor Charles. He'll become He is, I hissed. And he was. In the wan twilight, I could see it. The evil fingers of moonlight clawed at the windows, then entered in a long, bony webs of luminance. They seemed to strike at the blossoms in the captain's hands, and a white fire blazed forth. The odor, that unhallowed effluvium, seemed to strengthen in the lunar rays. I could not shut my nostrils to the increasing scent, the sorcerous scent that rose from my breath to my brain. The captain held the flowers, and I could see him change now. His nose was a snout. His eyes were red. Faint hair bristled on his face, coarsened in his beard and on the shadowed neck. His arms were long. He inhaled deeply, holding the gun steadily enough. Yes, it was true. He must have succumbed later than Charles. His stronger will had resisted longer, but now the flowers were winning. The wolf taint was in his blood, his lungs, his flesh. His shoulders slumped as he turned away. I'm going now, he mumbled. And it was dreadful to hear his deepened voice, his growling, slurring tones. You can go out and catch your werewolf whenever you please. I shan't care. My plane leaves at once. He left the room, stooping in a monstrous way. I wondered how long it would take for the change to be completed. How soon he would howl like a thing of darkness in the night. And how soon the world would howl with him, a nightmare world of shaggy wolves that tore away at the throats of all humanity and plunged Earth into a barren horror akin to the shining moon above. Edna, we have to stop him. She nodded. Together, we ran out into the hall toward the open door. And there in the garden twilight, we saw him running across the lawn. The night was still, but a faint breeze stirred, and on it was the strong, almost overpowering scent of the lycanthropic moonflowers. The vine trailed from the hands of the mad captain as he sped away. It filled the garden as the moonlight filled it. Under a full moon, the full scent rose in a world of white light, white perfume, white horror. Even as he crossed the lawn, the captain's body seemed to change. His coat sloughed off him. His form bent closer to the ground. His hands holding the blossoms were dark and hairy. Moonlight performed a dreadful acceleration of his condition. The scent was so strong that Edna reeled in faintness beside me. I smelled that damnable odor everywhere. Another smelled it. A long howl sounded from the bordering bushes near the walk. It was Charles. He had waited there, drawn back to the house by the scent of those maddening, evil-scented moon blossoms. The captain turned halfway. Charles saw him. Crept from the bushes, shaggy body crouching close to the ground. The captain held up one hand as though to shield himself, and the blossoms glistened slickly in the pale moonlight. Then Charles leaped forward. The wolf had dipped. Raking talons hurled the captain to the ground. With a triumphant baying, the wolf was at his throat. And the captain bayed back. It's Harry, Edna moaned, clinging to me. There before our eyes, two wolves fought and snarled in the moonlight, fighting with fang and claw, leaping and slashing with bloody muzzles. Back across the lawn they raced. The captain still clutching the ragged flowers in one paw. One paw that could not be real, yet was. The yelping rose in our ears. Choppy claws grated on bone. Two wolves fought to the death, and through the growling came an abominable, throaty voice. I must have the blossoms, Charles. And then it happened. The flower slipped from wolf paws as the two rolled in a rending embrace. I raced silently across the lawn, caught up the scented moonflowers, and sped back to Edna. Come on, I whispered. Let's get out of here. She turned and ran at my heels as I made for the car, clutching a handful of demonic blossoms. Behind us, the baying rose to the cold moon. What? Where? Gasped the girl. To the ship, Panic. Put these things aboard. Zerd said it was ready. We're going to send them up in the ship. Let them plunge back into space. Back to the moon, perhaps. Anything. Must get them off the earth. Suppose I was a little delirious, but the notion fastened to me. It was the only way to cleanse the world of the terror, the scented terror. I raced the car. Terry, look! Down the silvery white road that gleamed in the moonlight behind us, two figures loped. Two fully formed wolves. Charles and the captain had discovered the theft of the blossoms, and now they pursued. It was a mad race through midnight, with two creatures of myth howling at our heels, the scent of doom welling in our nostrils as I shot the speed up. We turned. The running forms vanished from behind us, yet they were coming. And I was in a garden, a cool, sweet garden, and the air was a white wine that I breathed richly, intoxicating myself with the deep fire of strange new life. I was in a garden, and Edna was beside me, eyes closed, lips open, to inhale the magic perfume of rapture. No, I wasn't in a garden. I was in a car, doing 70 miles an hour down a moon-blazed road, while between my face and Edna's rested the damnable cluster of vampiric blossoms, their scent sucking our souls out with every breath. The cursed things were getting at us. I dared not throw them away. Those things behind would catch up, find them. I dared not. I had to fight to keep awake, to keep speeding down the road toward the ship. Yet I didn't want to fight. I wanted to sleep, to rest, to forget everything except the beauty of perfumed dreams. Now I understood the enslavement of opium eaters, of hash-eat addicts, who sought strange worlds of the mind at the expense of their bodies. Edna must not be exposed to this scent any longer. I shot up to 100, screaming down the road toward the plain where the ship rested. Edna lay white and still, her bosom rising and falling in rhythm with the heaving blossoms that called out as though to touch her milky, moon-white skin. Edna! We jarred to a halt before the great, gleaming bulk of the ship. I wanted to rest. I could smell the scent, and I wanted to rest. The moonlight hurt my eyes, so easy to close them, to forget. Blinking painfully, I threw the door open and jumped to my feet. I shook Edna into wakefulness. She moaned, Come on, I panicked. Hurry! The ladder still hung, although the door was closed. I forced Edna to mount before me, placing the blossoms in her hands. It was awful to see her fingers close lovingly about the stems of leprous growths. Awful to see the cataleptic stare in her eyes, the way those eyes slanted in the moonlight. But I had to have my hands free to support her, to urge her upwards. We scrambled up the ladder, and I prayed that the door was unlocked. It was. The captain had left in haste. We pulled ourselves into the darkened cabin of the ship. I fumbled for lights. Edna crouched on the floor, clasping the flowers to her face. I had to tear them away from her. In the little cabin, the scent rose strongly, compellingly. We had to get out of here. I fumbled with the panel controls. Impossible, of course, to chart a course, to plan. Just to throw a switch with a half-minute's delay, catch hold of Edna, and hurry out in time to be clear of the ship as it left, taking with it in its plunge those damnable blossoms. It was the only way. Get those things off Earth before it was too late. I studied the panel for a moment. There must be no hesitation. We were in danger from the scent ourselves. Or was it a danger? It was so pleasant, that odor, so peaceful. why not surrender? And then, from without the door, from the ground below, a long dreadful howling from two threats. They had found us. They were waiting. That was the end. Couldn't escape. I knew it then. Knew that the things that waited would rend and tear if we ventured outside. And here, within the cabin, the flowers still rustled as though filled with alien, moon-given life. The scent rose stronger on the air. Edna lay still beside the blossoms, breathing. Howls rose from the outside. I found pen and paper then. Had to keep from going mad. Had to concentrate on something, anything but the howling outside and the quiet horror of scent within. So I scribbled this. I don't know how long I've been sitting here. There is no howling any longer, but low, whining sounds proclaim that the waiters are patient. My task is finished, but I cannot step outside to face those ravening fangs. Those fangs set in what were once human throats. Nor can I stay inside. The air is close. No, there's no air any longer. There's merely the scent. For a while, it weakened me while writing, and now it seems to be easier to breathe. I can hear myself breathing, quite hoarsely, but easily enough. I feel a little better, a little stronger. Perhaps I'm immune. Edna is still asleep when she's stirring. Maybe she too is immune. I pray that this is so. She is waking now. The flowers still move. Her breathing is attuned. So is mine. Perhaps there's nothing to worry about. What shall we do? It's difficult to write these last words for some reason. The labor makes me glance down at my hands, and I'll read the answer there. My hands are growing darker. There are hairs sprouting on them. The fingers are curling. The dark hairs are sprouting. I know what I must do now. I thought we'd throw the switch and leap out and send the flowers back to the moon, or back into space. But we cannot leave. That was the problem. But it's been solved, dreadfully solved. We shall have to go with the flowers now, out into space. My hands are hairy. Sitting here in the close confines of the cabin has done it. I have breathed too many fumes. No wonder I don't mind it any longer. Don't try to resist that cursed scent. I'm changing. How soon, I wonder? Better start the ship now. Edna mustn't know. Pray to God she doesn't know. The knowledge would kill her. Just start the ship and pray she doesn't suspect it first. Good idea. If she doesn't know, then she'll trust me. She's smiling at me now, bravely. Her blue eyes, so frank, so trusting. Still she breathes in rhythm and white blossoms. I won't tell her, because then, when I get hungry enough, I don't get hungry when I look at her now. I can approach her. She trusts me. She doesn't know what the flowers have done to me. And the pulse beat in her white neck moves up and down, and I'm hungry. When we're plunging out there in the spatial darkness, all alone, it will be too late to think of my hairy hands when I do tell her. When I tell her to take her. Throw the switch now. Throw this manuscript out of the ship. I'm hungry. The perfume from the white flowers is making me hungry. Well, there will soon be a feast. Yes, very soon. And yet, I wonder. Edna's standing at my side now, trying to read what I write. She still isn't afraid, and has just laid one hand on mine. And I see something else. There will be a feast soon out in space. Perhaps I will not be the feaster. Edna's hand is growing hairy too.
The Eyes of the Panther by Ambrosebierce. 1. One does not always marry when insane. A man and a woman, nature had done the grouping, sat on a rustic seat in the late afternoon. The man was middle-aged, slender, swarthy, with the expression of a poet and the complexion of a pirate, a man at whom one would look again. The woman was young, blonde, graceful, with something in her figure and movement suggesting the word lithe. She was habited in a gray gown, with odd brown markings in the texture. She may have been beautiful, one could not readily say, for her eyes denied attention to all else. They were gray-green, long and narrow, with an expression defying analysis. One could only know that they were disquieting. Cleopatra may have had such eyes. The man and the woman talked. "Yes," said the woman, "I love you. God knows. But marry you? No, I cannot, will not." "Irene, you said that many times, yet always have denied me a reason. I have a right to know, to understand, to feel and prove my fortitude if I have it. Give me a reason." "For loving you?" The woman was smiling through her tears and her pallor. That did not stir any sense of humor in the man. "No, there's no reason for that. Reason for not marrying me. I have a right to know. I must know. I will know." He had risen and was standing before her with clenched hands. On his face, a frown. It might have been called a scowl. He looked as if he might attempt to learn by strangling her. She smiled no more, merely sat looking up into his face with a fixed, set regard that was utterly without emotion or sentiment. Yet it had something in it that tamed his resentment and made him shiver. "You are determined to have my reason?" she asked in a tone that was entirely mechanical, a tone that might have been her look made audible. "If you please, if I'm not asking too much." Apparently, this lord of creation was yielding some part of his dominion over his co-creature. "Very well, you shall know. I am insane." The man started, then looked incredulous and was conscious that he ought to be amused. But again, the sense of humor failed him in his need, and despite his disbelief, he was profoundly disturbed by that which he did not believe. Between our convictions and our feelings, there is no good understanding. "That is what the physicians would say," the woman continued, "if they knew. I might myself prefer to call it a case of possession. Sit down and hear what I have to say." The man silently resumed his seat beside her on the rustic bench by the wayside. Over against them, on the eastern side of the valley, the hills were already sunset flushed, and the stillness all about was of that peculiar quality that foretells the twilight. Something of its mysterious and significant solemnity had imparted itself to the man's mood. In the spiritual, as in the material world, are signs and presages of night, rarely meeting her look, and whenever he did so, conscious of the indefinable dread with which, despite their feline beauty, her eyes always affected him. Jenna Braden listened in silence to the story told by Irene Marlowe. In deference to the reader's possible prejudice against the artless method of an unpracticed historian, the author ventures
to substitute his own version for hers. 2. A room may be too narrow for 3, though 1 is outside. In a little log house containing a single room, sparely and rudely furnished, crouching on the floor against one of the walls, was a woman, clasping to her breast a child. Outside, a dense, unbroken forest extended for many miles in every direction. This was at night, and the room was black dark. No human eye could have discerned the woman and the child. Yet, they were observed, narrowly, vigilantly, with never even a momentary slackening of attention. And that is the pivotal fact upon which this narrative turns. Charles Marlowe was of the class, now extinct in this country, of woodmen pioneers, men who found their most acceptable surroundings in sylvan solitudes that stretched along the eastern slope of the Mississippi Valley, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. For more than 100 years, these men pushed ever westward, generation after generation, with rifle and axe, reclaiming from nature and her savage children here and there an isolated acreage for the plow. No sooner reclaimed than surrendered to their less venturesome but more thrifty successors. At last they burst through the edge of the forest into the open country and vanished as if they had fallen over a cliff. The woodman pioneer is no more, the pioneer of the plains, he whose easy task it was to subdue for occupancy 2/3 of the country in a single generation, is another and inferior creation. With Charles Marlowe in the wilderness, sharing the dangers, hardships, and privations of that strange, unprofitable life, were his wife and child, to whom, in the manner of his class, in which the domestic virtues were a religion, he was passionately attached. The woman was still young enough to be comely, new enough to the awful isolation of her lot to be cheerful, by withholding the large capacity for happiness, which the simple satisfactions of the forest life could not have filled. Heaven had dealt honorably with her in her light household task, her child, her husband, and her few foolish books. She found abundant provision for her needs. One morning in midsummer, Marlowe took down his rifle from the wooden hooks on the wall and signified his intention of getting game. "We've meat enough," said the wife. "Please don't go out today. I dreamed last night. Oh, such a dreadful thing. I cannot recollect it, but I'm almost sure that it will come to pass if you go out." It is painful to confess that Marlowe received this solemn statement with less of gravity than was due to the mysterious nature of the calamity foreshadowed. In truth, he laughed. "Try to remember," he said. "Maybe you dreamed that baby had lost the power of speech." The conjecture was obviously suggested by the fact that baby, clinging to the fringe of his hunting coat with all her 10 pudgy thumbs, was at that moment uttering her sense of the situation in a series of exultant goo-goos, inspired by sight of her father's raccoon skin cap. The woman yielded. Lacking the gift of humor, she could not hold out against his kindly badinage. So, with a kiss for the mother and a kiss for the child, he left the house and closed the door upon his happiness forever. At nightfall, he had not returned. The woman prepared supper and waited. Then she put baby to bed and sang softly to her until she slept. By this time, the fire on the hearth at which she had cooked supper had burned out, and the room was lighted by a single candle. This she afterward placed in the open window as a sign and welcome to the hunter if he should approach from that side. She had thoughtfully closed and barred the door against such wild animals as might prefer it to an open window, of the habits of beasts of prey, and entering a house uninvited, she was not advised, though with true female provision, she may have considered the possibility of their entrance by way of the chimney. As the night wore on, she became not less anxious, but more drowsy, and at last rested her arms upon the bed by the child, and her head upon the arms. The candle in the window burned down to the socket, sputtered, and flared a moment, and went out unobserved. For the woman slept and dreamed. In her dreams, she sat beside the cradle of a second child. The first one was dead. The father was dead. The home in the forest was lost, and the dwelling in which she lived was unfamiliar. There were heavy oaken doors, always closed, and outside the windows, fastened into the thick stone walls, were iron bars, obviously, so she thought, a provision against Indians. All this she noted with an infinite self-pity, but without surprise, an emotion unknown in dreams. The child in the cradle was invisible under its coverlet, which something impelled her to remove. She did so, disclosing the face of a wild animal. In the shock of this dreadful revelation, the dreamer awoke, trembling in the darkness of her cabin in the wood. As a sense of her actual surroundings came slowly back to her, she felt for the child that was not a dream, and assured herself by its breathing that all was well with it. Nor could she forbear to pass a hand lightly across its face. Then, moved by some impulse for which she probably could not have accounted, she rose and took the sleeping babe in her arms, holding it close against her breast. The head of the child's cot was against the wall to which the woman now turned her back as she stood. Lifting her eyes, she saw two bright objects staring the darkness with a reddish-green glow. She took them to be two coals on the hearth, but with her returning sense of direction came the disquieting consciousness that they were not in that quarter of the room. Moreover, were too high, being nearly at the level of the eyes, of her own eyes, for these were the eyes of a panther. The beast was at the open window, directly opposite and not 5 paces away. Nothing but those terrible eyes was visible, but in the dreadful tumult of her feelings, as the situation disclosed itself to her understanding, she somehow knew that the animal was standing on its hinder feet, supporting itself with its paws on the window ledge. That signified a malign interest, not the mere gratification of an indolent curiosity. The consciousness of the attitude was an added horror, accentuating the menace of those awful eyes, in whose steadfast fire her strength and courage were alike consumed. Under their silent questioning, she shuddered and turned sick. Her knees failed her, and by degrees, instinctively, striving to avoid a sudden movement that might bring the beast upon her, she sank to the floor, crouched against the wall, and tried to shield the babe with her trembling body, without drawing her gaze from the luminous orbs that were killing her. No thought of her husband came to her in her agony, no hope, nor suggestion of rescue or escape. Her capacity for thought and feeling had narrowed to the dimensions of a single emotion: fear of the animal's spring, of the impact of its body, the buffeting of its great arms, the feel of its teeth in her throat, the mangling of her babe. Motionless now, and in absolute silence, she awaited her doom. The moments growing to hours, to years, to ages, and still those devilish eyes maintained their watch. Returning to his cabin late at night, with a deer on his shoulders, Charles Marlowe tried the door. It did not yield. He knocked, There was no answer. He laid down his deer and went round to the window. As he turned the angle of the building, he fancied he heard a sound as of stealthy footfalls and a rustling in the undergrowth of the forest. But they were too slight for certainty, even to his practiced ear. Approaching the window, and to his surprise, finding it open, he threw his leg over the sill and entered. All was darkness and silence. He groped his way to the fireplace, struck a match, and lit a candle. Then he looked about. Cowering on the floor against the wall was his wife, clasping his child. As he sprang toward her, she rose and broke into laughter, long, loud, and mechanical, devoid of gladness and devoid of sense, the laughter that is not out of keeping with the clanking of a chain. Hardly knowing what he did, he extended his arms. She laid the babe in them. It was dead, pressed to death in its mother's embrace. 3. The theory of the defense. That is what occurred during a night in a forest, but not all of it did Irene Marlowe relate to Jenna Braden. Not all of it was known to her. When she had concluded the sun was below the horizon, and the long summer twilight had begun to deepen in the hollows of the land. For some moments, Braden was silent, expecting the narrative to be carried forward to some definite connection with the conversation introducing it. But the narrator was as silent as he, her face averted, her hands clasping and unclasping themselves as they lay in her lap, with a singular suggestion of an activity independent of her will. It is a sad, a terrible story, said Braden at last, but I do not understand. You call Charles Marlowe father, that I know. That he is old before his time, broken by some great sorrow, I have seen, or thought I saw. But, pardon me, you said that I am insane, said the girl, without a movement of head or body. But Irene, you say, please, dear, do not look away from me. You say that the child was dead, not demented. Yes, that one. I am the second. I was born 3 months after that night, my mother being mercifully permitted to lay down her life in giving me mine. Braden was again silent. He was a trifle dazed and could not at once think of the right thing to say. Her face was still turned away. In his embarrassment, he reached impulsively toward the hands that lay closing and unclosing in her lap. But something, he could not have said what, restrained him. He then remembered, vaguely, that he had never altogether cared to take her hand. Is it likely, she resumed, that a person born under such circumstances is like others, is what you call sane? Braden did not reply. He was preoccupied with a new thought that was taking shape in his mind, what a scientist would have called an hypothesis, a detective, a theory. It might throw an added light, albeit a lurid one, upon such doubt of her sanity as her own assertion had not dispelled. The country was still new, and outside the villages, sparsely populated. The professional hunter was still a familiar figure, and among his trophies were heads and pelts of the larger kinds of game. Tales variously credible of nocturnal meetings with savage animals and lonely roads were sometimes current, passed through the customary stages of growth and decay, and were forgotten. A recent addition to these popular apocrypha, originating apparently by spontaneous generation in several households, was of a panther which had frightened some of their members by looking in at windows by night. The yarn had caused its little ripple of excitement, had even attained to the distinction of a place in the local newspaper. But Braden had given it no attention. Its likeness to the story to which he had just listened now impressed him as perhaps more than accidental. Was it not possible that the one story had suggested the other, that finding congenial conditions in a morbid mind and a fertile fancy, it had grown to the tragic tale that he had heard? Braden recalled certain circumstances of the girl's history and disposition, of which, with loves and curiosity, he had hitherto been heedless, such as her solitary life with her father, at whose house no one, apparently, was an acceptable visitor, and her strange fear of the night, by which those who knew her best accounted for her never being seen after dark. Surely in such a mind, imagination once kindled might burn with a lawless flame, penetrating and enveloping the entire structure. That she was mad, though the conviction gave him the acutest pain, he could no longer doubt. She had only mistaken an effect of her mental disorder for its cause, bringing into imaginary relation with her own personality the vagaries of the local myth makers, with some vague intention of testing his new theory, and no very definite notion of how to set about it. He said gravely, but with hesitation, "Irene, dear, tell me. I beg you will not take offense, but tell me." "I have told you," she interrupted, speaking with a passionate earnestness that he had not known her to show. "I have already told you that we cannot marry. Is anything else worth saying?" Before he could stop her, she had sprung from her seat and without another word or look was gliding away among the trees toward her father's house. Braden had risen to detain her. He stood watching her in silence until she had vanished in the gloom. Suddenly, he started as if he had been shot. His face took on an expression of amazement and alarm. In one of the black shadows into which she had disappeared, he had caught a quick, brief glimpse of shining eyes. For an instant, he was dazed and irresolute. Then he dashed into the wood after her, shouting, "Irene! Irene, look out! The panther! The panther!" In a moment, he had passed through the fringe of forest into open ground and saw the girl's gray skirt vanishing into her father's door. No panther was visible. 4. An appeal to the conscience of God. Jenna Braden, attorney at law, lived in a cottage at the edge of the town. Directly behind the dwelling was the forest. Being a bachelor, and therefore by the draconian moral code of the time and place, denied the services of the only species of domestic servant known thereabout, the hired girl, he boarded at the village hotel, where also was his office. The woodside cottage was merely a lodging maintained at no great cost, to be sure, as an evidence of prosperity and respectability. It would hardly do for one to whom the local newspaper had pointed with pride as the foremost jurist of his time to be homeless, albeit he may sometimes have suspected that the words home and house were not strictly synonymous. Indeed, his consciousness of the disparity and his will to harmonize it were matters of logical inference, for it was generally reported that soon after the cottage was built, its owner had made a futile venture in the direction of marriage, had, in truth, gone so far as to be rejected by the beautiful but eccentric daughter of old man Marlowe, the recluse. This was publicly believed because he had told it himself, and she had not, a reversal of the usual order of things, which could hardly fail to carry conviction. Braden's bedroom was at the rear of the house, with a single window facing the forest. One night, he was awakened by a noise at that window. He could hardly have said what it was like. With a little thrill of the nerves, he sat up in bed and laid hold of the revolver which, with a forethought most commendable in one addicted to the habit of sleeping on the ground floor with an open window, he had put under his pillow. The room was in absolute darkness, but being unterrified, he knew where to direct his eyes, and there he held them, awaiting in silence what further might occur. He could now dimly discern the aperture, a square of lighter black. Presently there appeared at its lower edge 2 gleaming eyes that burned with a malignant luster, inexpressibly terrible. Braden's heart gave a great jump, then seemed to stand still. A chill passed along his spine and through his hair. He felt the blood forsake his cheeks. He could not have cried out, not to save his life, but being a man of courage, he would not, to save his life, have done so if he had been able. Some trepidation his coward body might feel, but his spirit was of sterner stuff. Slowly the shining eyes rose with a steady motion that seemed an approach, and slowly rose Braden's right hand, holding the pistol. He fired. Blinded by the flash and stunned by the report, Braden nevertheless heard, or fancied that he heard, the wild, high scream of the panther, so human in sound, so devilish in suggestion. Leaping from the bed, he hastily clothed himself and, pistol in hand, sprang from the door, meeting 2 or 3 men who came running up from the road. A brief explanation was followed by a cautious search of the house. The grass was wet with dew. Beneath the window it had been trodden and partly leveled for a wide space, from which a devious trail, visible in the light of a lantern, led away into the bushes. One of the men stumbled and fell upon his hands, which, as he rose and rubbed them together, were slippery. On examination, they were seen to be red with blood. An encounter, unarmed, with a wounded panther was not agreeable to their taste. All but Braden turned back. He, with lantern and pistol, pushed courageously forward into the wood. Passing through a difficult undergrowth, he came into a small opening, and there his courage had its reward. For there he found the body of his victim, but it was no panther. What it was is told, even to this day, upon a weather-worn headstone in the village churchyard, and for many years was attested daily at the graveside by the bent figure and sorrow-seamed face of old man Marlowe, to whose soul and to the soul of his strange, unhappy child, peace. Peace and reparation. A Child's Nightmare by Robert Graves, published in 1918 for Fairies and Fusiliers. Through long nursery nights he stood by my bed unwearying, loomed gigantic, formless, queer, purring in my haunted ear, that same hideous nightmare thing, talking as he lapped my blood, in a voice cruel and flat, saying forever, "Cat, cat, cat." That one word was all he said. That one word through all my sleep, in monotonous mock despair. Nonsense may be light as air, but there's nonsense that can keep horror bristling round the head, when a voice cruel and flat says forever, "Cat, cat, cat." He had faded. He was gone years ago with nursery land, when he leapt on me again from the clank of a night train, overpowered me foot and head, lapped my blood, while on and on the old voice, cruel and flat, says forever, "Cat, cat, cat." Morphia drowsed. Again I lay in a crater by Highwood, He was there with straddling legs, staring eyes as big as eggs, purring as he lapped my blood, his black bulk darkening the day, with a voice cruel and flat. Cat! 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 He said. Cat! Cat! When I'm shot through heart and head, and there's no choice but to die, the last word I'll hear, no doubt, won't be charge or bomb them out, nor the stretcher bearer's cry, let that body be, he's dead, but a voice cruel and flat, saying forever, cat, cat, cat. A Song of the Werewolf Folk by Robert E. Howard. Sink white fangs in the throat of life. Lap up the red that gushes in the cold dark gloom of the bare black stones. In the gorge where the black wind rushes, slink where the titan boulders poise and the chasms grind thereunder. Over the mountains black and bare, in the teeth of the brooding thunder. Why should we wish for the fertile fields, valley, and crystal fountain? This is our doom, the hunger trail, the wolf and the storm-stalked mountain. Over us stalk the bellowing gods, where the dusk and the twilight sever. Under their iron goatish hoofs, they crunch our skulls forever. Mercy and hope and pity, all bubbles the black crags sunder. Hunger is all the gods have left, and the death that lurks thereunder. Glut mad fangs in the blood of life, to slake the thirst past sating, before the blind worms mouth our bones, and the vulture's beak is grating. Thank you for listening. Have a great night.